The suburb where we live is so peaceful that sometimes it seems like time has stopped. The small cobblestone streets, the shady old trees, and the gentle chirping of birds every morning create a picture of fairy tale beauty. The house we have chosen to call home is not only a shelter, but also a symbol of our dreams of a perfect family. Built more than 2 centuries ago, the house has the look of a bygone era, with gray stone walls, moss-covered tiled roofs, and stained glass windows that are typical of the Victorian era. At first, everything was great. My wife Claire loved the old-fashioned atmosphere and the quiet, despite her frequent business trips. As a father, I spent most of my time looking after our 7-year-old son, Thomas. He was my world, shy, sensitive, but full of imagination. In his early days, Thomas loved to explore the large house, imagining himself as an explorer in search of hidden treasure. I would laugh when I heard him trotting across the wooden floors, his footsteps echoing down the long hallways. Over time, however, something began to change. At first, it was just a fleeting feeling. A shadow passed in the corner of my eye, strange sounds in the dead of night, the creaking of wood, a soft whisper, barely audible. I told myself it was just my imagination, that an old house would always have its own sounds. But then, things became clearer. Thomas began to change. Evenings that had been filled with laughter and stories, he became quieter. Sometimes I caught him standing in front of the window, looking out into the garden with a distant look in his eyes. I asked him questions, but Thomas just shook his head and said nothing. Sometimes I saw him wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, but he refused to tell me why. It culminated in a stormy night. Claire was away on business, and Thomas and I were the only ones left in the house. Thunder rumbled, lightning lit up the back garden, revealing the old trees swaying in the strong wind. I checked the windows, making sure everything was closed before going to bed. But as I walked down the hallway to Thomas's room, I felt a chill run down my spine. The door to his room was slightly ajar, revealing a small beam of light from the night light inside. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was filled with the dim light from Thomas's favorite bear-shaped nightlight. The boy was lying on the bed, the blanket pulled up to his chin. From a distance, he looked like he was sleeping. I went over to pull the blanket back, but a sudden feeling of unease arose in my heart. Thomas wasn't lying still as usual. He was staring out the window, where raindrops were hitting the glass in a chaotic rhythm. The lightning outside illuminated his face, pale, not his usual self. His lips were curled into a strange smile, stretching from ear to ear. My heart sank as I realized that this wasn't the smile of the innocent child I knew. I sat down on the edge of the bed, gently pulling the covers back, trying not to wake him. But his eyes didn't change. They pierced me, making me take an involuntary step back. For a moment, I wondered if I was imagining things. My eyes accidentally stopped under the bed. Something caught my attention. I bent down, my breath catching in my throat. Under the bed, in the dim light, I saw another child. His eyes were wide, filled with fear. He was huddled in the corner, his whole body shaking. I recognized him immediately. It was Thomas. I felt my blood run cold. The child under the bed whispered, but no sound came out. It just looked at me, its lips moving desperately. I turned my head, looking at the bed. Thomas, or at least something that looked like Thomas, was still sitting there, staring at me with a strange smile. The air in the room became thick. The night light flickered on and off, then suddenly went out, leaving the room in complete darkness. I tried to move, but my legs felt frozen. My breathing echoed in the eerie silence. Suddenly, a cold hand touched my shoulder. I threw myself back, but saw nothing but darkness. When the light returned, both children, on the bed and under it, had disappeared. I collapsed to the floor, unable to breathe. The emptiness of the room scared me more than anything. I don't know how long I sat there, but when the clock struck midnight, I finally mustered up the courage to leave the room. That night, I sat in the living room holding Thomas, the real Thomas this time. The rain continued to fall outside, but I could feel nothing but the cold seeping into my skin. I knew I couldn't stay here another day. The next day, we left the house, taking with us memories that I knew would haunt me for the rest of my life. But even after leaving that place, I could not forget it. Late at night, in my fitful sleep, I still heard a soft laughter echoing in my head, and a haunting question that would not let go. "Dad, don't you recognize me? I am your son." I've always believed that I was up for anything. As a nature lover since childhood, I grew up dreaming of exploring wild places, away from the modern world. I was fascinated by hiking videos, books about humans and nature coming together, and the thought of feeling free in the middle of an endless forest always excited me. That weekend, I decided to make my dream come true. The Schwarzwald, or Black Forest of Germany, was my destination, a place known for its dense forests, winding trails, and eerily quiet atmosphere. I wasn't looking for a partner. I wanted complete freedom, just me, my rucksack with basic necessities, and the road stretching out before me. That day, nature seemed to smile at me. The sky was clear and cloudless. The cool air carried the scent of pine needles and moist soil. The towering trees rustled in the gentle breeze, revealing sunlight that filtered through the leaves, creating dancing spots of light on the ground covered with orange leaves. I felt like I had stepped into a classical painting, a world completely separate from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. For 8 hours, I walked slowly, following no particular route. The small streams flowing, the birds chirping in the trees, and the feeling of being separated from the real world made me feel strangely relaxed. I didn't care how far I walked, but each step seemed to bring me closer to nature. As the sun began to set, the light softening and the woods taking on a golden hue of twilight, I realized I had gone too far. The shadows of the trees stretched across the trail, casting a shadowy shadow over the landscape. I decided to turn back, but soon realized it would not be as easy as I had thought. The path back seemed nothing like the one I had come upon. The landmarks I had tried to remember at first seemed unfamiliar, almost lost. The towering trees, once my friendly companions, now seemed to form a dense wall, surrounding me in silence. I tried to stay calm, searching for any familiar signs, but each step only took me deeper into the jungle. The sun had disappeared below the horizon, and darkness fell like a thick blanket. I fumbled for my flashlight in my backpack, but its feeble light only illuminated a few feet ahead. Every sound in the forest, the rustle of leaves, the snapping of branches, was now so clear it startled me. I didn't dare call out, not wanting to attract the attention of anything, wild animals, or anything else. Just as I was about to give up, the flashlight beam swept over a blurry figure. A small cabin appeared behind the trees. The roof was covered in moss, the wooden walls were rotten, and the door was slightly open as if inviting. The cabin looked old, almost swallowed by nature, but to me at that moment, it seemed like the only salvation. I went to knock on the door, hoping someone was inside. There was no answer. I pushed it open, and it creaked open into a dark space. The flashlight illuminated every corner of the cabin, revealing a simple but stuffy space. In the middle of the cabin was a single bed, strangely clean, as if it had just been cleaned. On the old wooden table was a candle that had burned out, leaving streaks of hardened wax. I sat on the edge of the bed, my legs aching and tired. The softness of the bed relaxed me, but a strange feeling lingered around me, as if the space wasn't completely empty. I looked up, and my heart sank. Portraits hung on the walls of the cabin. The faces wore an indescribable expression, half smiling, half contorted. Their eyes, they didn't just see, they watched. Every time I moved the flashlight, it seemed as if their eyes were moving too. I forced myself to close my eyes, telling myself that I was just tired and my imagination was playing tricks on me. But even with my eyes closed, I could still feel those eyes piercing through my eyelids, as if they were still staring at me. Somehow I fell asleep, but it was not a peaceful sleep. I dreamed of those faces laughing loudly, their laughter echoing throughout the cabin endlessly. I saw myself standing in the middle of the forest, surrounded by indistinct figures, all looking at me. When I woke up, light from outside was pouring in through the window. The cabin now looked strangely empty. I looked up at the walls where paintings once hung, but now there were only blank wooden walls. Then I realized the most horrifying thing. The pictures I saw last night weren't pictures. They were faces looking in through the windows from outside the cabin. I jumped up and ran out of the cabin without catching my breath. The scenery outside seemed to blur with tears. I ran, not knowing where I was going, only that I had to get away from there. When I found the car, I almost collapsed. With shaking hands, I opened the door, jumped in, locked everything, and sat there gasping for breath. For the first time in my life, I felt completely helpless. To this day, I can't explain what happened. But every time I close my eyes, I can still feel that gaze, the gaze from the forest, still watching me. As a surgeon in a large hospital, I was used to working all-night shifts that stretched into the morning. Despite my exhaustion, I always kept my spirits up because I knew that every minute of my time could decide someone's life. However, during those long hours, things happened that I never thought I would have to face. Things that were not in medical books, that did not follow any of the laws of science. The hospital where I work uses a simple but effective color-coded card system. Green cards for those who are recovering, red cards for those who have passed away. The division is clear and unmistakable. Every time I see a red card, I feel a heavy burden. Although my job is to save lives, death is still inevitable. It comes suddenly, coldly, and leaves a sense of helplessness in the hearts of those who witness it. That night, my shift seemed normal. As the clock ticked past 2 a.m., I was asked to go down to the basement to retrieve some emergency surgical supplies. The basement was where equipment and supplies were stored, an area isolated from the main areas of the hospital. The hallway leading down there was quiet and cold. The fluorescent lights flickered, and my footsteps echoed on the tiled floors. I was so used to the scene that I didn't notice the eerie feeling that permeated the air. As I entered the elevator, I realized I was not alone. A woman was standing in the corner of the elevator, leaning quietly against the wall. She was wearing the hospital's signature light blue hospital gown. She was slim, with long black hair that partially covered her face. I assumed she was a patient who was allowed to walk around the hospital to exercise. Our hospital always encourages patients to leave their rooms to reduce stress and improve their spirits. I smiled politely as I stepped into the elevator, but she didn't respond. Her eyes were blank, emotionless, as if she couldn't really see me. A feeling of unease flashed through my heart, but I tried to push it away. Maybe she was just tired, like me after a long day at work. I pressed the button for the basement and noticed something odd. She hadn't pressed her floor. Did that mean she was going to the basement, too? A patient going to the supplies room in the middle of the night. It didn't make sense, but I didn't ask. We stood in silence, the only sound being the hum of the elevator and my soft breathing. The elevator doors opened, revealing the basement hallway. The lighting was dimmer than I remembered, the cold space feeling cut off from the rest of the hospital. As I stepped out, I saw a figure in the distance. A man was limping toward the elevator. His gait was unsteady and slow, each step a painful effort. At first I thought he was an elderly patient who had gotten lost, but as I got closer, the light from the elevator illuminated his wrist, where a red tag dangled. I stood there, stunned. I recognized him immediately. He was a patient of mine who had died in surgery the night before. I had done everything I could, but I had failed. The memory of the operation was still fresh, and his death was something I had not yet overcome. And now he was standing before me, the clear signs of death on his wrist. A chill ran down my spine. Why was he here? I tried to reason with myself. Maybe it was someone who looked like him, or maybe the dim lighting was confusing me. But no, I knew I wasn't mistaken. The red card was undeniable proof. My hands shook as I pressed the close button. The man moved closer, and I could see his eyes, empty but penetrating. The elevator doors closed before he could step in. I breathed a sigh of relief, but my heart was still racing, my mind reeling with unanswered questions. The atmosphere in the elevator became stifling. I tried to calm down, but the absolute silence only increased my fear. Suddenly, the woman's voice rang out, cold and sharp, breaking the atmosphere. "What are you doing?" "He just wants to use the elevator." I turned. The woman was still standing in the corner of the elevator, but her eyes were no longer blank. They were full of annoyance, as if blaming me. I tried to explain, but my voice was shaking, almost inaudible. I said he was dead, that I had operated on him. She didn't respond right away. Instead, a strange smile played on her lips. "Red card," she repeated, and raised her left wrist. On her wrist, a bright red card dangled. My whole body stiffened. I couldn't speak. Her smile widened, distorted to the point of being inhuman. She took a step toward me, but the elevator suddenly shook violently. The lights flickered, and I felt as if the space around me was distorting. When the elevator doors opened, I found myself sprawled on the floor, cold sweat pouring down my face. The doors opened to some floor of the hospital, but there was no one in the elevator. I jumped up and rushed out, trying not to look back. From that night on, I never worked the night shift alone again. Every time I entered the elevator, I always checked everyone's wrists. But sometimes I wondered how many people were still secretly wearing red tags without me realizing it. I had just moved into a small apartment located in an old but cozy building in the heart of the city. The building wasn't overly modern, but its affordable price and convenient location made me sign the lease without hesitation. When I came to pick up the keys from the front desk, the building manager, an elderly woman with a calm yet slightly grim expression, handed me the keys with a smile, but before I left, she said in a serious tone, "There is one thing you need to remember. On your floor, there is a door without a number. Never, and I emphasize, never try to open it or even look through the peephole." I nodded, thinking it was just a scary story meant to deter curious residents or a way to keep people from prying. She seemed unwilling to explain further, and I didn't press the issue. My mind was preoccupied with unpacking and setting up my new apartment. My apartment was located on the 4th floor, at the end of the hallway. Just as the manager had said, there was a door without a number along that hallway. It looked older than the other doors. The paint was peeling, and the doorknob was tarnished as though it had been neglected for years. Every time I passed by, I felt a strange chill emanating from the other side of the door, but I pushed the thought away. I was busy unpacking, setting up my new home, and didn't have time to focus on these odd warnings. However, on my first night in the apartment, curiosity began to creep into my mind. Why was there a door without a number? Why did the manager warn me? I tried to push these questions out of my head in sleep, but they clung to me like shadows. Finally, unable to resist any longer, I decided to check it out. I stepped out of my apartment and walked down the hallway toward the door without a number. The hallway was eerily silent, with only the sound of a faint breeze whistling through the window at the end of the corridor. The atmosphere felt thick, as if waiting for something to happen. Every step I took made the silence feel even more oppressive. I turned the doorknob, but as I had expected, it was locked. Undeterred, I knelt down and peered through the peephole. The room on the other side appeared empty, or so it seemed. The faint glow of a small light illuminated the floor, enough for me to see that the room was bare. The walls were stripped, the floor was covered in dust, and there was no furniture. But just as my eyes scanned the room, I saw her. A woman stood in the corner of the room, facing the wall. Her hair was long and black, cascading down her shoulders, and her skin was so pale that it almost glowed under the dim light. She didn't move, she didn't turn around. She just stood there, silently like a statue. My heart raced in my chest. I pulled back, feeling as though I had intruded on someone's private space. Maybe she didn't want to be disturbed, I thought to myself. But curiosity is a powerful thing. The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about the woman. Who was she? Why was she there in a locked room? I decided to go back. This time, when I peered through the peephole, I no longer saw the empty room. All I saw was a brilliant red. It felt as though someone had placed a red cloth over the peephole, or maybe it was something else. My heart tightened. Maybe she had known I had spied on her the night before and decided to block my view. I returned to my apartment, but the unease only grew stronger. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I decided to go down to the front desk and ask. When I mentioned the door to the manager, her face grew serious. "You looked through the peephole, didn't you?" she asked, her voice heavy with weariness. I nodded, admitting to it. She sighed deeply, and then began to tell me a story. Many years ago, that room belonged to a young couple. They were special, but not in a good way. The wife had pale skin, long black hair, and eyes as red as blood. The husband was not right. He was jealous, violent, insane. One night, in a fit of jealous rage, he killed his wife in that room. They say he chopped her body into pieces, but when the police arrived, they couldn't find her remains. However, since that night, other residents started seeing her, standing in the corner of the room, facing the wall. And her red eyes. They say that if she knows someone is peeping through the hole, she won't let them go. I froze, unable to speak. But I only saw red, I stammered. The manager looked directly at me, her gaze cold. "Those are her eyes. She's looking right at you." I left the front desk, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know if her story was true, but that night, I didn't dare leave my apartment. I locked the door tightly and sat on the couch, my eyes glued to the hallway outside. Then, at midnight, I heard a knock at the door. 3 soft knocks, as if someone didn't want to disturb me too much. I froze. "Don't open the door," I told myself. But the knocks kept coming, rhythmic, one after the other. And in that moment, I realized the knocking wasn't coming from my apartment door. It was coming from the door without a number. Cold sweat ran down my back. The knocks grew louder and faster, the rhythm becoming more insistent. The voice that whispered from the other side of the door was faint, but it echoed through the silence of the hallway. "You saw me, didn't you?" the voice whispered, cold and mournful, as if it was coming from right behind the door. "You can't hide from me." I couldn't breathe, my throat felt tight. Suddenly, I understood what I had seen wasn't just a figment of my imagination. She was there, behind that door, and she knew I had been watching. I still remember clearly that day, a cold winter afternoon in the suburbs of Germany. The house my family lived in was isolated, surrounded by withered trees and a narrow, rocky path. Everything was quiet, as if the entire world outside had been covered by a thick blanket of winter. I was upstairs, sitting in my small room, busily doing my homework. The sound of my pencil scratching on paper blended with the steady ticking of the clock on the wall. While I was immersed in my calculations, I heard my mother's voice call up from downstairs. It was a familiar tone, signaling that dinner was ready. Her voice was warm and comforting, just like any other day. I smiled, put down my pencil, and stood up eagerly, heading out of my room. But as soon as I reached the stairs, a cold, icy hand suddenly grabbed my arm and pulled me forcefully into the laundry room beside me. My body froze, panic surged in my chest. I turned to scream, but immediately recognized the person standing in front of me. It was my mother. Her face was pale, her eyes red and swollen, as though she had been crying for a long time. She looked haggard and frightened, so much so that I couldn't speak. No words were necessary. Her fear quickly transferred to me. She pulled me down to sit in the corner of the laundry room. The small room was dimly lit by the light from the hallway filtering through a crack in the door. From here, I could hear my mother's voice again from downstairs. It was calling out, sweetly and familiarly, urging us to come down for dinner. But something was wrong. The longer I listened, the more I realized that, although the voice sounded just like my mother's, it carried a cold, lifeless, and unnatural tone. Time seemed to stand still. The air in the small room was suffocating, making it hard for me to breathe. Outside, the sound of slow footsteps echoed, heavy as though someone was walking up the stairs. Each step rang out in the empty hallway, making every cell in my body tense up. The footsteps stopped right in front of the laundry room door. I could hear the heavy, steady breathing on the other side of the door. In the darkness of the laundry room, I held my breath, the weight of fear pressing down on my chest. Every sense of mine was focused on the door, where the faint light from the crack was now obscured, as if something was standing right in front of it. I couldn't move, couldn't make a sound. The presence outside didn't seem to try to open the door, but its presence was unmistakable, like it was waiting for something. The minutes dragged on in utter tension. Finally, the footsteps moved away from the door, slowly descending the stairs. But even after the sounds faded, the chilling and oppressive feeling lingered in the air. My mother and I stayed perfectly still, huddled together in the dark, listening to every small noise, as though waiting for something to happen. The silence was unbearable, broken only by the wind outside howling through the cracks in the window, bringing the biting cold of winter into the room. The entire night seemed to blur, and I don't remember how long I stayed awake. But every time I closed my eyes, I heard the calling, the footsteps from downstairs echoing up, as if whatever was in the house with us was still lingering, waiting. Every small sound made me jump, my heart pounding with the fear that it could come back at any moment. When the first rays of the sun finally streamed through the window, I dared to move. My mother pulled me out of the laundry room, both of us exhausted. The floor downstairs was eerily silent, as though nothing had ever happened. But as soon as I stepped down the stairs, a cold draft swept down my spine. The front door of the house was wide open, with the wind blowing in and rustling the dry leaves scattered across the floor. A feeling of emptiness washed over me as I looked out the door, unable to shake the question. What had been in the house with us last night? What had tried to call me downstairs? And why had it left the door open, as if inviting something in? I never found the answers to those questions, but from that day on, I could never bring myself to stay alone in that house again. The calls from downstairs still haunted me every night, a constant reminder that some things should never be investigated. After that night, everything seemed different. The house, once warm and familiar, now felt cold and hollow. Even in the daylight, the air seemed to carry a strange heaviness, like something unseen was always watching, waiting. I would hear the faint creaks of the floorboards in the quiet of the night, and the unsettling sensation that the house was never truly empty. It was as though the entity that had been there with us had left its mark, and it would return when it chose. Each night, the calling would start again, soft, sweet, almost comforting at first, but slowly growing more insistent, more hollow. I couldn't tell whether it was my mother's voice anymore, or if something else had taken her place. I would lay awake in bed, heart pounding, listening to the whispers and footsteps, wondering when it would come back, what it wanted, and whether we would ever be able to leave without it following us. The house had become a prison, and the fear I felt seemed to seep into every corner. The walls, once a place of comfort, now seemed to close in on me. Even when my mother tried to reassure me, I could see the same terror in her eyes that I felt in my own chest. We were no longer safe, no longer at peace. And every time the wind howled through the cracks in the windows, or the floorboards creaked in the silence, I knew that whatever had happened that night was only the beginning. Now, even after moving away, the memories still cling to me like the cold of that winter night. The house may be behind me, but the darkness, the calling, and the footsteps will always be a part of me, a reminder of the things we should never question, the things we should never look for in the dark. I never thought my life would be tied to a nightmare, but that's exactly what happened when I met Elias. My childhood was lonely and filled with ridicule. I didn't have real friends, always the lost child being ignored by others. When Elias moved to Castlereagh in the summer of 1993, I thought I had finally found a true companion. Elias's family lived in a large wooden house at the edge of the Castlereagh forest, a dense and gloomy forest that we were often warned not to wander too far into. But like every other child, we were enchanted by its mystery. On long, endless afternoons, we ventured deep into the woods, building forts, and sometimes just sitting quietly, listening to the whispers of nature. Elias was always the leader, braver than me, daring to face things I would never try. Our friendship lasted for 5 years, even when our parents had fiery arguments over reasons I never fully understood. I didn't care. Elias was the only friend I had, and I didn't want to lose him. But on a hot summer day in 1998, Elias disappeared, and everything began from that day. That day, Elias had brought a folding knife he had stolen from his father. I remember the anxious feeling when I saw the shiny blade glinting in the sunlight filtering through the leaves. We were playing a stupid game, using the knife to sharpen sticks into arrows and daring each other to carve symbols into the tree trunks. But when I accidentally cut my finger, the blood flowed endlessly, and Elias just laughed, telling me not to make a fuss. I decided to head back home to find a Band-Aid, while Elias stayed behind to choose the perfect tree to carve our names into. I returned to Castlereagh Forest after bandaging my finger, but Elias was no longer where we had been. I called his name, but only the wind through the trees responded. As I ventured further into the forest, I saw Elias's folding knife lodged firmly into the trunk of an old oak tree, the blade sticking out like a chilling reminder. But Elias was nowhere to be found. The police were called, and things quickly became chaotic. Elias was missing, without a trace, no sound, nothing. The whole town went into a panic, and stories about Castlereagh Forest began to spread. People said the forest was cursed, that those who ventured too deep would never return. I didn't believe those stories. I thought Elias had simply gotten lost, or maybe he had run away. But over the following years, the forest seemed to change. I never set foot there again, but I always felt drawn to it. Strange dreams haunted me, where I would hear Elias's voice, his call echoing between the dark trees, urging me to come back and find him. During the day, I tried to ignore it, but every night, the dreams returned, growing clearer with each passing night. In 2016, a massive storm hit Castlereagh. That night, while sitting alone on the couch, I saw a faint light coming from the forest. The orange glow barely pierced through the trees, like a small fire smoldering in the distance. A strange intuition made me grab a flashlight, leave the house, and walk through the muddy garden into the woods. The light led me to the old oak tree, the very tree Elias had chosen the day he disappeared. In the large, lightning-scarred trunk was a large crack, and inside it I saw him. Elias, or at least a form resembling him, stood there, covered in decaying wood and moss. His eyes were pure white, his skin pale, and his face was distorted, but unmistakable. It was Elias. He looked at me and smiled, a cold, empty smile. His mouth opened, but instead of sound, only a blast of freezing wind swept through the forest. I stood frozen, paralyzed by fear, as Elias reached out his hand and pointed directly at me. A cold chill ran down my spine, and in that moment, I realized he was no longer the friend I once knew. In the following nights, I began to hear the call again. Elias's voice echoed from the forest every night, soft yet eerie. He wanted me to come back. He wanted me to help him. But I knew that the Castlereagh forest had taken Elias, transforming him into something no longer human. One night, unable to bear the pressure, I returned to the old oak tree, carrying a knife and a faint glimmer of hope that I could free Elias. But when I arrived, he was already waiting. His face, now completely deformed, covered in cracks and mold, stared at me with hollow eyes. He whispered, his voice full of agony, that only blood could free him. Human blood. I don't know what possessed me, but I began to follow his request. In the weeks that followed, I searched the town, hunting small animals, then gradually moving on to larger targets. Their blood was never enough. Elias remained trapped, his body continuing to rot, and his demands grew larger. My story has no clear ending. Elias remains there, in the old oak tree, waiting for me to bring him what he needs. But I can't do it anymore. No matter how beautiful our friendship once was, what exists in the Castlereagh forest now is no longer the Elias I knew. It is something else, something monstrous, and I know that if I continue, it won't stop until the entire town is destroyed. I write these words as a warning to anyone daring to step into Castlereagh forest. If you hear the call, no matter how familiar it may sound, never answer. Run, before the forest takes your soul too. It started out normal enough, a quiet evening in suburban Iowa. I stood outside my boyfriend's house, a flashlight in my hand illuminating the small driveway to his truck. The air was cool and quiet, except for the wind rustling through the trees and the sound of my footsteps on the gravel. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary until I heard that sound. At first, it sounded like a twig snapping or the earth ripping apart, a faint but unnatural sound in the stillness of the night. I immediately turned my flashlight toward the sound, its flickering light illuminating the pitch-black space. And then I saw it. A giant creature stood right next to my boyfriend's truck. For a moment, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. The darkness obscured most of its body, leaving only a vague outline, but what held my attention were its bright blue eyes, reflecting the light from my flashlight. Those eyes were unlike any creature I had ever seen. Not only were they bright, but they seemed to see through me. The creature stood there, motionless, making no sound. Just its eyes, cold and glittering in the darkness. I froze, not daring to move. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my chest. The creature was so tall that it towered over the truck, at least 8 feet tall, if not more. As I gathered my courage and stepped toward it, the light from my flashlight flickered, and before I could react, the creature disappeared silently into the darkness, as if it had never existed. I turned back inside, trying to convince myself that it was just a dream or my imagination. But I couldn't sleep that night. The image of the glowing blue eyes kept appearing in my mind every time I closed my eyes. I spent the night Googling, hoping to find a plausible explanation. Iowa big horse, glowing-eyed creature, mysterious giant animal. The results were vague, unsatisfying stories. Part of me began to wonder if I had seen something beyond my imagination, something not of this world. The next morning, I decided to forget about it and go about my life as usual. But that didn't last long. Late that afternoon, my dog, a smart and friendly Labrador, started barking furiously, looking towards the field behind the house. I rushed outside to see what was going on, and that's when I saw him again. The giant creature stood in the middle of the field, only a few hundred meters away from me. This time, the light from the setting sun fell on its body, allowing me to see it more clearly. Glossy black fur covered its body, and its gait was unlike any animal I had ever seen. It stood upright on its hind legs, muscular, but its feet were animal-shaped, with sharp claws. When it turned to look at me, its blue eyes glowed in the evening light, as if daring me to come closer. I didn't dare move, just stood there watching it run across the field and disappear into the woods. I tried to convince myself it was a dream, but the giant footprints in the wet mud the next morning proved otherwise. They were 3 times the size of a human foot, each step at least 5 feet long. I began to feel as if I was being watched. Over the next few weeks, things got worse. I would hear strange noises outside at night, branches snapping, wind whistling through the windows, and sometimes a deep growl coming from the woods. My dog became increasingly anxious, barking at empty spaces, especially toward the dense forest behind the house. I tried shining a flashlight around, but all I could see was pitch blackness, as if it was hiding something. One time, I found a large scratch on a tree trunk near my house. The scratches were so deep that I could easily insert my fingers, and they formed sharp claws. I began to realize that this creature was not just a strange phenomenon, but could be a real threat. I decided to set up surveillance cameras around my house, hoping to catch a glimpse of the mysterious creature. When I checked the footage in the morning, I could hardly believe my eyes. There it was, tall, powerful, and mysterious. Its blue eyes stared straight into the camera, as if it knew it was being watched. Then suddenly it walked out of the frame, leaving an eerie silence. I didn't dare go out after dark anymore. Those images, along with the feeling of being watched, made me feel claustrophobic. I didn't know what this creature was, but I knew one thing for sure. It wasn't a horse, not a deer, nor any animal that belonged here. From that first night, my life changed forever. I no longer felt safe in my own home. Every time the sun set, I would just sit quietly in my room, feeling like those blue eyes were waiting for me out there, in the darkness. If you live in Iowa, or anywhere near a forest, be aware of your surroundings at night. If you see a blue light in the distance, do everything you can to get back to safety. Sometimes there are things that humans should never learn. I learned that lesson, and I pray that you don't have to go through the same. The story begins on a cold autumn afternoon when I, Isolde Marceau, landed a job that I believed would change my life. After months of unemployment in Strasbourg, France, I came across a strange ad pinned to a public bulletin board. It read, "Apprentices wanted. Experience in traditional bookbinding required. Must be comfortable with unusual hours and unconventional materials. Contact 11 Rue de Ombres." The address led me to a small house, tucked between 2 tall buildings in the heart of Strasbourg's old town. The facade looked old, with cracked windows that reflected strange light. As I stared, it felt as if the entire house was changing shape, layers upon layers of windows and roof tiles rearranging when I wasn't looking directly at it. The man who opened the door, Etienne Noir, was the epitome of a classic bookbinder. Hunched over, ink-stained hands, and a leather apron scarred. But his eyes, the deep, soulless gaze, made me uneasy. I entered anyway, drawn by the thought of learning from a master. Etienne Noir's bookbinding workshop seemed ordinary at first glance. There were antique wooden work tables, shelves full of tools, and the smell of leather and glue filled the air. I quickly got used to the work, cutting paper, sewing spines, binding covers. Etienne was always there, watching my every move, occasionally giving dry but precise instructions. But that normalcy only lasted a few weeks. I began to notice strange things. Ruler rods that measured different lengths each day. Needles that moved on the table when no one was looking. And the shadows in the workshop were deeper than they should have been, as if they had a different, darker depth. One morning, I found a poem written on my desk, in Etienne's sturdy handwriting. Between bound pages, a whisper rises from the endless abyss. I couldn't help but read it over and over again, and each time I read it, I felt as if someone were whispering in my ear. After 3 months on the job, Etienne assigned me my first truly challenging project, binding a stack of loose pages that had just arrived. The pages were in a large leather briefcase, and the person who delivered them, a man named Lucien Grive, looked like he had just stepped out of a nightmare. His skin was pale, his hands were shaking as he handed over the package, and his shadow seemed to move in a way that was out of sync with his body. "These pages are special," he said softly, his eyes glancing around the workshop as if he feared something. "They must be sealed before nightfall. Be careful with the bindings. If they are not properly bound, they will escape." I smiled stiffly, thinking he was joking, but when I opened the briefcase, all sense of security vanished. The pages were strangely warm, as if they were radiating heat. The writing was unlike any language I had ever seen. The characters seemed to crawl, shifting their positions as I tried to look straight. Etienne stood behind me, his voice soft but cold. "These books are unlike anything you've ever done before. They're not just knowledge, they're gateways to other places. Since the beginning of the project, I have been haunted by strange dreams. In them, I see endless libraries, bookshelves so high that I can't see the top. The books whisper in a language I don't understand, but each word echoes in my mind, leaving a dull ache when I wake. In a dream, I saw a creature standing in the middle of a deserted crossroads, under a pitch-black sky. The creature was humanoid, but not quite. Its 4 arms were stretched out in an unnatural way, its eyes were dark pits, and its forehead bore a glowing symbol. A symbol identical to the seal on the briefcase I had received. When I woke up, the letters from my dream appeared on my skin. At first, I thought they were just ink stains, but they never went away, and they changed position every time I slept. In the right light, they seemed to come alive, moving as if trying to tell a story I didn't want to understand. One evening, nearing the end of the book, I put the final stitches on the leather cover. But as the needle pierced the leather, the world around me changed. I was no longer in the workshop, but in a desolate wasteland with an inky sky and a blood-red sun hanging low. The silence was eerily quiet, broken only by the sound of steady breathing. In the distance, I saw the creature from my dream. It stood still, its 4 arms raised, as if commanding the darkness around it. I couldn't move, drawn to its gaze, a gaze filled with nothing but endless hunger. I returned to the workshop, shaking, with the completed book on the table. Etienne stood behind me, his eyes shining with satisfaction. "You did well, Isolde. The Dark One will be pleased." I never left the workshop after that night. I couldn't. Etienne continued to hand me books, and each one carried a piece of something bigger. I understood that I was helping to create a portal that would open our world to the creatures outside. The words on my skin now covered my entire body, moving constantly. I couldn't read them, but I knew they told my story, the story of an apprentice lost in his own darkness. Strasbourg was now but a memory. The outside world no longer meant anything to me. I had become a part of what the Dark One wanted, and I knew that one day, when all the books were finished, the gate would open. And then, nothing can save us. Telling this story still sends shivers down my spine as I relive every terrifying moment of that hike in my mind. It all started out normal enough. One day in early fall 2018, I decided to spend a few days in the Adirondacks to immerse myself in nature and enjoy the solitude I craved. I had hiked alone many times before, but this time I felt a strange sense of anticipation that made me even more excited. Little did I know that this trip would change my life forever. It was a beautiful Monday morning. I walked along the trail, the sunlight filtering through the golden canopy, the forest coming to life in the gentle breeze. Birds sang overhead, the leaves rustled under my feet, making me feel one with nature. I walked a few miles and set up camp near a small stream, where the trickling water provided the perfect soundtrack. After cooking some food, I stretched out on the bank and gazed up at the starry night sky. The twinkling lights seemed to wash away all my worries, and that night I slept soundly amidst the whispers of the forest. The next morning, feeling energized, I decided to leave the trail and explore a new area. I was well prepared, carrying a compass, a map, and plenty of water. The forest looked peaceful at first. I followed a small stream, walked through the bushes, and by noon I reached a mountain peak with a picturesque view. Sitting on a rock, I ate lunch and let myself be immersed in the beauty of nature. But then, things started to change. At first, I noticed that the sounds around me seemed to have disappeared. There were no bird songs, no wind blowing through the trees, no insects buzzing. The forest was completely silent. It was unlike the silence I had felt while hiking. This silence seemed to have a weight, pressing on my ears and creating an inexplicable sense of unease. I stood up and listened, but there was nothing. Even the sound of my own footsteps on the dry leaves was muffled. My heart beat faster. I took out my compass to check the direction, but everything seemed to make no sense. I was still going in the right direction, but the feeling of unease in my heart grew. I decided to head back to the trail. But as I started walking, I realized that everything around me seemed different. Tall, ancient trees that I didn't remember seeing before, their dense foliage blocking the sunlight, casting eerie shadows across the ground. I couldn't find the path I'd taken just hours ago. With each step, my memory seemed to fade, as if the forest was erasing every trace I'd ever seen. I wandered around, hoping to find a familiar landmark. But every path led me to unfamiliar territory. It felt like I was trapped in an invisible maze where time and space lost their meaning. As I was struggling to find a way out, I saw something through the dense undergrowth. It was an old, tattered tent, made of dirty rags stretched over broken branches. Nearby was a rusty axe and a fire that had died down, leaving only charred bones. I moved closer, hoping to find help or some clue. But when I looked closely, I realized that the bones did not look like animal bones. They were long, curved, and had strange scratches, as if they had been gnawed by something unnatural. A chill ran down my spine. I could tell that I was not alone. There was no sound except my own labored breathing, but I could sense something watching me from the darkness. I turned my head and almost screamed when I saw a silhouette looming between the trees. It was a tall, thin figure, moving quickly as if avoiding my gaze. I rubbed my eyes, trying to get a better look, but when I looked again, it was gone. Panic gripped me, and I decided to run. I ran like crazy, not caring where I was going, only knowing that I had to get out of the forest. Leaves and branches whipped at my face, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the fear in my heart. I only stopped when my lungs burned, and my legs couldn't carry me anymore. I collapsed to the ground, gasping for air, and only then did I realize that I was completely lost. I tried to calm myself, but the air around me seemed to be getting heavier. The darkness was closing in on the forest faster than usual, and I had the feeling that the trees were getting closer, as if they were watching me. Again, I heard the whisper, But this time it was clearer, a faint voice as if from far away. Go before it's too late. I didn't know if I had heard it or imagined it, but I didn't dare stay another minute. I trudged through the darkness, feeling like the forest was sucking every breath out of me. Finally, I heard the sound of running water. It was the stream near where I had set up camp. I had never felt more relieved. I quickly gathered my things, leaving behind what was not needed, and began to leave the forest. I walked all night, despite my exhaustion and the darkness. Every time I heard a small sound, I jumped, afraid that the figure would appear again. As the first light of day filtered through the trees, I stepped out from the edge of the forest. I fell to my knees, almost crying with relief. But I knew that I had not left that forest without taking some of its darkness with me. I never returned to the Adirondacks after that. But the nightmare never seemed to leave me. Sometimes, when I was home alone at night, I would hear the wind whistling, like a whisper from the woods. Sometimes I felt like there was a shadow standing at the edge of my vision, watching me waiting. I don't know what happened in that forest, whether it was supernatural or just a trick of the mind. But I know one thing for sure. There was something sinister in the silence of the Adirondack forest. And I pray that no one else has to face it like I did. I am Adrian Caron, 34 years old, living in St. Croix, a peaceful village in the Dordogne, in the south of France. All my life I believed that if I lived a simple life, staying out of danger, nothing bad would happen to me. But things have changed. My last memories of St. Croix now seem like a distant, hazy dream, overshadowed by what happened next. That night, I woke up in darkness. Not ordinary darkness, but a dense darkness that seemed to weigh down my senses. I had no memory of how I got there. The familiar little room, the smell of rotting wood, and the light from the old night light were gone. Instead, the air around me was thick, filled with the stench of blood and the sweet smell of rotting flesh. I couldn't see anything. I tried to sit up, but my body felt heavy, as if hundreds of invisible hands were holding me down. What I touched wasn't earth or floor beneath my hands. It was soft, slimy, and warm, like a living body. Just as I tried to focus my senses, the thing twitched, and I screamed in terror. My eyes slowly adjusted to the darkness, and a faint light began to appear. Not the light of the sun or any artificial light source, but a red glow from the streaks of light on the ground, like glowing veins running beneath living flesh. All around me, huge masses of muscle contracted and twitched, emitting a wet, sickening sound. The sky above me was not the sky of the world I knew. There were no stars, no moon, no light. Just a pitch-black void, so deep that I felt like I could fall into it at any moment. But what terrified me most was not the sky. It was the sound. At first, it was just a low moan, like the breathing of a giant creature hidden deep underground. But then it became clearer, like hundreds of voices blending together, whispering words I didn't understand. Each word carried a sharp pain like a knife, and I felt like my head was about to explode. As I struggled to stand, I noticed that the ground wasn't just made of living flesh. It was also filled with small mouths, filled with sharp teeth. They opened and closed as if breathing, and when I moved, they made low growling sounds, as if displeased with my presence. I walked carefully, away from the mouths, but every step I took seemed to only lead me closer to the giant lumps of flesh, growing taller and taller. Then I saw them. Hundreds of eyes appeared on the ground, on the pulsating mass of muscle. Each eye was bloodshot, glowing in the red light from the ground. They did not blink, did not take their eyes off me. It felt like they were examining every cell of my body, as if I were some kind of disgusting creature. I wanted to scream, to run away, but my feet felt glued to the living ground. A cold wind blew by, carrying a strong fishy smell, and then I heard a voice. My child. The voice rang out, deep and authoritative, as if coming from deep within the earth. I turned and saw a huge wall, towering like a mountain, looming behind me. But it was not a wall of stone. It was a wall of flesh, undulating and pulsing, with hundreds of eyes opening on its surface. Beneath those eyes, a giant mouth was forming, layers of muscle and fat twisting together, forming lips, teeth, and a tongue. "You are mine," the voice continued, as if the mouth were speaking each word. "Why do you ask for deliverance? I created you. I am your God." I was speechless. I backed away, but every step I took made the ground beneath me twitch, as if it were alive and sensing my every movement. I wanted to deny everything that was happening, but every second that passed made it clear that this was no dream. As I turned, trying to find a way out, I saw them, 3 tall, slender figures approaching. They did not walk, but glided across the raw flesh like creatures not of this world. Their bodies were long, almost broken, and their pale skin reflected a red light from the ground. Their eyes were black holes, sucking in all the light around them. When they looked at me, I felt like my soul was being stripped bare, every memory and thought exposed to them. They said nothing, just stood there, observing me like a pitiful creature. One of them finally moved, long limbs extending, and I realized they weren't arms. They were soft, slimy appendages, sliding along the ground. It bent down, revealing a pale, twitching mass of innards. Its voice echoed in my head, soft but terrifying. "Poor child. You hate your existence. Let us help you." I don't know why, but I believed them. I had no choice. My twisted fingers trembled as I held the organ, and as I tied it around my neck, I felt as if everything I had ever known had vanished. The creatures lifted me up, and I swayed in the air to the strange rhythm of this world. Beneath my feet, the walls of flesh, eyes, and living ground spun, turning into a red whirlwind. I don't know where they're taking me, but I do know one thing. This isn't the end. This is just the beginning of an eternal nightmare, where I belong to a world that will never let me escape. I am Nicholas, 21 years old, living in the east of France, in a small, peaceful village near Lyon. To be honest, I have always been a skeptic of all supernatural stories. Things like ghosts, wandering souls, or any other mysterious phenomena have never made me believe. I have always explained everything with logic and science. But then, about 4 years ago, something happened that not only changed my perspective completely, but also left a lasting impression on my mind. It was the story of my mother's house and a night of terror that I will never forget. I was 17 at the time and living with my mother in a 2-story house, but the layout was a little odd. The downstairs consisted of a small living room, a laundry room, a guest bedroom, never used, and stairs leading upstairs, where the master bedroom, kitchen, and my bedroom were. It was a quiet house, nothing special, but it had a strange feel to it that I had never noticed before. I was often home alone at night because my mother often had to work overtime. I liked this sense of privacy, and the house, although old, always made me feel safe. But one night, everything changed. That day, I decided to drive to my favorite pizza place, about 20 minutes away from home. Before I left, everything was completely normal. The house was no different. But when I returned, the first feeling I had when I walked through the door was that I was being watched. At first, I told myself it was just my imagination, but the feeling didn't go away. Instead, it grew stronger, as if some invisible gaze was piercing my back. I calmed myself down, then decided to check the entire house, upstairs and downstairs, even the garage. Nothing. No one. But the strange silence of the house, to the point of not even a creak, made me feel even more uneasy. I decided to go back to my room, lock the door, and play video games to forget my worries. But when the hallway light turned on, I started to notice strange shadows moving through the cracks of the door. It wasn't my shadow, because I didn't move. Every time I looked towards the door, everything was silent, as if nothing had happened. I told myself I was imagining things. But then, as I turned off my computer to go to sleep, I noticed something strange. Through the crack in my door, I saw two black dots, the shape of which resembled boots, standing motionless just outside. I froze. My hand shook as I reached for the hunting knife I always kept by my bed. I waited, but the boots didn't move. Mustering up my courage, I decided to confront whatever, or whoever, was standing outside. When I opened the door, the hallway was empty. The lights were still on, and there was no sign of anyone there. I was momentarily relieved, but the unease did not leave me. I left the door open, turned on the light in my room, and decided not to sleep anymore. As I was watching a video on my phone, I heard a noise from downstairs. Footsteps, heavy, slow, creaking on the wooden stairs. They stopped at the top of the stairs, right at the entrance to the hallway. I froze. It felt like my blood had stopped flowing. My arms shook as I held the hunting knife. I didn't dare breathe, afraid that any noise would alert whatever was out there. After what seemed like an eternity, I decided to act. I jumped out of bed and ran straight into the bathroom down the hall. I locked the door, called 911, and whispered the whole story in a trembling voice. The police arrived about 15 minutes later. They searched the entire house, but found no signs of forced entry or anyone in the house. They said maybe I was imagining things, or that the footsteps were just the creaking of the old house. I wanted to believe them, but deep down I knew something was wrong. The next day, my mother returned, and we decided to check the house again. This time, we noticed something that neither I nor the police had missed. The door to the attic, which was in my room, was wide open. I had never noticed that my room had an attic door. My mother didn't know about it either. None of us could explain why the door was open. We couldn't reach it, and my mother was sure she never touched it. That only made my fear greater. My mother didn't want to stop there. She decided to contact the previous owner of the house to learn more about its history. What she discovered made me shudder. The previous landlord said that her father had committed suicide in the very room I was sleeping in. His death was described as sudden and mysterious, but no one knew exactly what happened. A few years later, when I told this story to an acquaintance who claimed to be a psychic, I was shocked when she said, "Those footsteps were heavy, weren't they?" He was a big man. I didn't tell her any details, but she described exactly how I felt when I heard those footsteps. She added, "Your door was closed the next morning, wasn't it?" It was him. He was still there. I have never felt so cold. I have long since moved out of that house, but the story still haunts me at night. Even as I write this, in a different house, I feel as if someone is watching me. I don't know what happened that night, a lost soul, a supernatural phenomenon, or something we can't explain. Either way, I know one thing. I will never be alone in that house again. My name is Emily, and I come from a small town in Brittany, France. In 2015, as a 22-year-old girl, I went through a terrifying experience that made me question my own sanity. What happened not only turned my life upside down, but also left me a person who lives in constant fear. This is not the usual story of a haunted house or a ghost, but a much more horrifying truth: being manipulated by psychological technology. I want to share this story not only to free myself from the horrible memories, but also to warn you, because it can happen to anyone. It all started after I broke up with Jean-Marc, my long-term boyfriend, in the spring of 2015. He lived in Rennes, a city about 100 kilometers away from where I lived. After the breakup, I decided to move to Paris to start a new life. But before leaving, I stayed in my old town for a few days to sort things out. At that time, Jean-Marc often gathered with his two close friends, Julian and Thomas, in a small apartment near the center of town. Julian was a cold and mysterious person, while Thomas was always cheerful but had a strange look that I could not forget. They often smoked marijuana and discussed vague things, sometimes involving psychological games that I thought were just the jokes of bored people. After the breakup, I felt relieved that I no longer had to deal with Jean-Marc. But then things started to get strange. As I was driving home from Rennes, I started hearing whispers in my head. At first, I thought it was just my imagination or post-breakup stress. But the whispers became more and more distinct. The voices weren't mine, but Jean-Marc and Julian's. They said sarcastic things, laughed at me, and sometimes made strange suggestions like, "Don't even think about leaving. We won't let you do that." I tried to convince myself that this was just a manifestation of stress, but the feeling of being controlled became more and more obvious. I felt like someone was always watching me, not just with their eyes, but with their thoughts. A few days later, I returned to Rennes to meet a friend and stopped by Jean-Marc's apartment. Julian and Thomas were there too. As I entered the apartment, I could feel the heavy atmosphere. Jean-Marc offered me a joint, and I accepted, perhaps thinking it would help me relax. Instead, things got worse. Julian started looking at me with a strange look and said, "It's like a movie, isn't it?" His words sent shivers down my spine. I felt like I was trapped in a scenario that I couldn't escape from. One night, in Julian and Thomas's apartment, as I was trying to find an explanation for the voices in my head, Julian said to me frankly, "You're not crazy, Emily. We just want to test what kind of person you are." His words left me stunned. I asked how they could talk to me in my head, but Julian just sneered and didn't answer. At that point, Thomas stood up and said he needed to go out, but before leaving, he turned back and whispered, "You don't know what you're facing." Then Julian told me to go see Jean-Marc. In my head, I heard Jean-Marc's voice saying, "Come here, I need you." I decided to test this and asked Julian to shout a random word if he could really communicate with me through my thoughts. Julian, who was in another room, shouted the word I asked. That's when I knew I wasn't crazy. Something truly terrible was happening. From then on, the voices haunted me. They made me feel scared, isolated, and tired. Jean-Marc and Julian started playing weird mind games, like pretending they would kill themselves if I didn't do what they wanted. But when I stopped responding, they changed tactics. They made strange noises in my house, keeping me on my toes. One night, I found my bedroom window wide open, even though I was sure I had locked it before going to bed. Another night, I woke up to see a shadowy figure standing at the end of my bed, but when I turned on the light, there was no one there. I could no longer tell what was real and what was imaginary. As time went on, I felt more and more trapped in my own mind. I searched online and discovered that V2K, voice-to-skull technology, a technology that transmits sound directly into the brain, really existed. I began to suspect that Jean-Marc and his team were using this technology to manipulate me. One time, while driving, I heard Julian's voice saying, "Watch out ahead." Immediately, I had to brake hard to avoid hitting a large truck. I don't know how they did it, but I knew I wasn't safe. To this day, I still don't understand what their purpose was. To drive me crazy? To test a new technology? Or simply for fun? I moved away, hundreds of kilometers away from Rennes, but the fear still lingered. I share this story to warn you that things that seem like they only happen in science fiction movies can happen in the real world. If you feel like you are being stalked or manipulated, trust your instincts and seek help. Be careful, because there is much in this world that we do not fully understand. And sometimes, the cruelest people are the ones closest to us. I am Ethan Walker, an ordinary man living in the suburbs of Norwich, England. I have long prided myself on being rational, skeptical of the supernatural and unrealistic scare stories. But all that changed a few years ago, when I experienced what I can only describe as a vivid and haunting nightmare. This is not a story I will share easily, because it involves a system that I believe we have all been a part of. It all started with a giant retail chain that I will call Unimart, to avoid any confusion. It was more than just one store. It was an empire with thousands of branches around the world, selling everything from food and clothing to medicine and medical services. But little did I know that stepping into Unimart was more than just a normal shopping act. It was a gateway to control, brainwashing, and ultimately the destruction of my mind and body. It all started one winter afternoon in 2018. I stopped by Unimart to pick up some basic supplies. The store was crowded, the lighting was cold and fluorescent, and the shelves were lined with endless rows of goods. I remember feeling a little strange as soon as I walked in, a sense of being watched, as if hundreds of eyes were watching my every move. But I brushed it off, thinking it was just fatigue from a long day. I pushed my cart through the aisles, picking out the cheapest items I could find. Unimart is famous for its private label products. I'll call them best value. These are much cheaper than the other brands, and honestly, I've come to rely on them. I started to notice a change shortly after I started using best value foods and products. I felt more tired than usual, had trouble concentrating, and was having strange nightmares. In these dreams, I found myself trapped in an endless maze of shelves, with faceless figures passing by me, whispering words I couldn't understand. At first, I thought it was just stress from work and life. But after a few weeks, my health got worse. My skin started to turn pale, my hair started to fall out in clumps, and I always felt hungry no matter how much I ate. Worse, I started hearing voices in my head. These voices were very small, almost imperceptible, but they always whispered the same thing. Buy more. Eat more. Obey. I decided to find out what was going on. I started reading the labels on the best value products I regularly used. The ingredients seemed legit, but I couldn't figure out why my body was reacting the way it did. The more I looked, the more strange things I discovered. Some products didn't have the correct barcodes, and others listed factory addresses in places that didn't exist. One evening, as I lay in bed, I received an anonymous email. It contained just one line: Unimart doesn't just sell products. They sell control. Attached to the email was a lengthy document that revealed that Best Value was more than just a cheap brand. Their products were designed to be addictive, making consumers dependent on them. Chemicals were added to weaken the immune system, reduce resistance, and even interfere with the mind. One night, I decided to go back to Unimart, not to shop this time, but to find out the truth. I snuck into the storage area at the back of the store, which customers were not allowed to enter. All the rooms were locked, but I found a door that led to the basement. Downstairs, I found a room filled with monitors. Each screen displayed images from Unimart stores around the world. But what scared me the most were the videos showing customers eating in a strange, trance-like state. In the corner of the room, I saw a control panel with the words, Best Value Mind Experiment. As I tried to leave, I realized I was no longer alone. Figures appeared in the hallway, tall and faceless. They did not run, just silently walked towards me. I ran as fast as I could, my heart pounding, but the hallway seemed to stretch on forever. Finally, I found the exit and rushed out. But from that night on, I never felt safe again. I felt like someone was always watching me. The dreams became worse and worse, and I realized that I couldn't escape Unimart's control. I tell this story not to seek sympathy, but to warn you. Be careful what you buy, what you eat, and what you allow into your life. Unimart or any system like it doesn't just sell goods, it sells control. Ask yourself, are you truly free in your choices? Or are you, like me, just a puppet in the invisible hands of this commercial empire? Wake up before it's too late. I am Thomas Reed, a writer living in London who has always sought recognition in the literary world but never found it. My life has revolved around books, stories, and an endless obsession with documenting the world around me. But none of those years prepared me for what I am about to tell. A series of events that began one autumn night as fog blanketed the winding streets of this city. This is not a story I tell for fun, but a warning to anyone who dares to dream of discovering the truth behind reality. Because what I experienced not only changed my life, but also eroded my very soul, bit by bit. That night, the fog came early, rolling through the streets like a living thing. I had just received a rejection letter from a major publisher, my 12th in as many months. Your work lacks authenticity, they wrote. It lacks an understanding of true darkness. The words not only hurt, but they also left me in a strange state of emptiness. As I walked home through the deserted streets, I noticed something strange. The fog wasn't just fog. It swirled around me as if it were alive. It wrapped itself around streetlights, parked cars, and even shunned some passers-by. There seemed to be a will to it, a purpose I couldn't explain. As I walked through a narrow alley near Bloomsbury Square, I heard whispers. They came from no one or anywhere in particular. They seemed to speak directly into my mind, resonating with a deep part of my mind I had never known existed. Without thinking, I followed the whisper. The narrow alley seemed to lead me deeper into the labyrinth of London, where the dim light could not reach. When I reached a small square, an old church came into view. Warm light shone from the windows, but something was wrong. Its spires seemed to rise endlessly, and as I stared, I could swear they were moving. I stepped through the doorway, mesmerized. The entrance hall was dark, lit only by flickering candles and shadows dancing on the walls. Each step I took sounded unnatural, as if the sound did not belong here. On the walls, the stone carvings seemed to move as I glanced past. I began to feel dizzy, but a melodious voice spoke from ahead. "You've come just in time," a voice said. I turned and saw a woman of unusual appearance. She wore an elegant black dress. Her wavy hair was as black as night. Her eyes reflected the candlelight like liquid silver. "We've been waiting for you, Thomas Reed," she said, smiling strangely. "Wait for me." I stammered. How did she know my name? "You are a seeker of truth, and we need people like you," she said, leading me inside the church. The main room was larger than I expected, with rows of worn wooden pews surrounding a dark blue velvet pulpit. The air was heavy, and I felt like I was entering another world. There were others sitting there, but they did not look human. Shadows hid their faces, and I could not make out who they were. All of them held small books with strange symbols on them, and their eyes, if I could call them eyes, reflected the light in an odd way. "Welcome to the Murmurers," the woman said, her voice echoing throughout the church. "Tonight, we share words from beyond the mist." As she opened the book on the podium, I recognized the seal of Blackmere College, where I often found inspiration. But the seal had changed, the Latin letters swirling as if rewriting themselves. When she began to read, her words were unlike any language I had ever heard. They were a cacophony of whispers, distant shouts, and echoes from my own mind. The words weren't just heard, they were felt. I found myself immersed in strange images. Dark stars, vast entities hidden in darkness, and an endless void where light never reached. I wrote furiously in my notebook, but when I looked back, I saw that the text had been there before. My handwriting had transformed into stories I didn't remember ever thinking. "Will you join us?" the woman asked, her eyes blazing like two fires. I didn't know what to do. But as I looked at the book in my hands, I felt an irresistible pull. Inside it, I saw my own stories, stories that I had never written, but perfect in the way I had always wanted them to be. "Yes," I whispered, and the word echoed throughout the space. The shadows in the church laughed, and I felt a pang in my mind, as if a part of me had been taken away forever. I left the church as dawn was breaking, but London was no longer the same. The shadows were longer, the fog thicker, and the whispers followed me even after I left. I wrote relentlessly from then on, but my stories were no longer mine. They belonged to another force, a force I could neither understand nor control. Now, as you read this story, I have only one warning. Be careful what you look for. There are truths that should not be known, and words that should not be written. My name is Clara, and I work as a private investigator in New York. My work usually involves missing persons, fraud, and the occasional affair. It's a normal job in a city that never sleeps, where chaos and mystery are constant. But there was one case that changed the way I saw the world, and maybe my life. It all started with a chair. One Saturday, after finalizing a divorce, I decided to stop by my local Goodwill in search of a cheap piece of furniture. My Manhattan apartment is small, and I try to save money wherever I can. As I browsed the shelves filled with old stuff, my eye was drawn to a vintage chair. It was upholstered in a pale peach fabric, with intricate dragon motifs carved into the back. The sculptural details made me feel more like I was looking at a work of art than a piece of furniture. And the best part, it was half off. I think I just found a bargain. Without a car, I had to push the chair through the narrow streets of Manhattan to get home. The crowds of passers-by gave me strange looks, but I ignored them. I even smiled. I had rarely felt so happy. The chair became a focal point in my apartment, nestled between the fireplace and the desk. Once it was set up, I began cleaning it, paying close attention to the details. That's when I noticed something strange. Dark brown stains that looked like dried blood on the arms, and a large scratch on the leg that looked like an old scar. My cat, Pudding, immediately loved the chair. She jumped on it, curled up, and slept soundly on it, as if the chair had always belonged to her. That same evening, my phone rang. A man with a worried voice answered. He introduced himself as the manager of Rain Max, a famous pop star, and asked me to help investigate her disappearance. Rain had disappeared 3 weeks earlier, and although the police were investigating, their efforts had come to nothing. There were no leads, no witnesses, no security cameras. Rain had vanished from this world. I accepted and began investigating. But 2 weeks later, I had found no clues. The feeling of helplessness was unsettling, but what was even stranger was Pudding's sudden disappearance. My cat never left the apartment. I searched everywhere, every corner of the house and the whole neighborhood, but there was no sign of her. The emptiness made me feel like I was missing a part of myself. One evening, after a long day of investigating, I decided to sit down on my new chair. I lifted the backrest to get more comfortable and immediately froze. There was something strange on the chair, a patch of soft, orange fur, just like Pudding's. I reached out to touch it, but as soon as I did, a cold chill ran down my spine. I looked closer and realized that the fur had melted into the fabric of the chair. That night, I slept restlessly. In my dream, I found myself standing in a dark space surrounded by strange antique chairs. Each chair bore a different image, a man, a cat, and even my face reflected in another chair. A voice whispered from the darkness, "Every soul has a form, a place, and a purpose." When I woke up, sweat was dripping from my forehead. But what scared me most was the light from the living room shining through the bedroom door. I could have sworn I saw the dragon chair move slightly. The next morning, I turned on my computer to look at Rain Max's pictures. As I looked closely, I noticed the large dragon tattoo on her back. I compared it to the design on the chair, and my heart stopped. They were identical, every line, every detail. How could this be? I returned to Goodwill, hoping to find some information about the chair's origins. But the staff there said they didn't keep records of items sold. They also couldn't remember who had brought the chair. My feelings of helplessness and fear grew. I asked a friend who specializes in antiques to check it out. He looked at the chair for a long time and said, "Clara, this chair is unusual. It could be a cursed or sealed object. These patterns, they could be associated with spirits." Spirit. I didn't want to believe it. But the orange patches on the chair grew clearer. They didn't disappear, but seemed to come alive, as if the chair were swallowing pudding. Which led me to a terrifying hypothesis. Maybe Rain Max wasn't missing. Maybe she had been transformed into part of the chair, like my cat. I spent the next few days researching cursed antiques. I found many creepy stories about spirits sealed in the items, but nothing that could help me understand what was happening to my chair. I kept the chair in the house, not knowing if it was the right decision. Every night, I felt as if something was watching me. One time, when I walked into the living room in the middle of the night, I saw the chair seem to change shape, as if it was moving rhythmically with an invisible breath. Rain Max's disappearance remains unsolved. But I know one thing for sure. This chair is not an inanimate object. It holds a dark secret, and perhaps I have unwittingly brought a curse into my life. I can only hope that I am not the next victim. The story begins on a seemingly ordinary day. New York City is crowded and stuffy as usual, and I am racing against time to find a birthday present for my mother. Time is not on my side, and the guilt of being late makes me even more impatient. My mother has always loved souvenirs, things that have their own soul and story. That is why I decided to visit the antique shops scattered around the neighborhood. Among those shops, a small shop called Old Memories attracted me with its old but mysterious appearance. The wooden sign with faded handwriting swayed in the gentle breeze. Inside, the space was filled with a musty smell mixed with the scent of old wood and camphor. The pale yellow light from the antique lamps created a dim atmosphere, making everything seem like it belonged to another era. As I walked deeper into the store, I saw everything from antique clocks and silver jewelry to hazy oil paintings. But in a hidden corner, a small shelf of porcelain dolls immediately caught my eye. One of them stood out. The doll wore a Victorian blue dress with delicate white lace. Her brown hair was in soft waves that framed her meticulously painted face, and her glassy blue eyes seemed to be soulful. I picked it up. The doll was heavier than I expected, and the glossy paint on its face felt cold under my fingers. A strange feeling crept into my eyes as I looked into them. The light in the shop reflected off the glass, but the doll's gaze seemed to move with me. A momentary sense of disorientation passed through me, as if my mind was being pulled into another space, dim and unfamiliar. I shuddered, dismissing the thought, telling myself I was just tired. The saleswoman, an elderly woman with thick glasses, stood behind the counter and watched me from a distance. As I approached to pay, she smiled, but it was not a pleasant smile. Her eyes swept over the doll in my hands with a strange familiarity, as if she were looking at an old friend. Her voice was hoarse, saying that the doll was special, but she also warned that it was a bit of a hassle. I felt uncomfortable with that comment, but I quickly left the store, thinking I was just exaggerating things. Back in my small apartment, I placed the doll on my desk. In the dim light from the desk lamp, it looked like a work of art. But when I looked at the eyes, the creepy feeling returned. It was as if there was a consciousness silently observing them. That night, I couldn't sleep. Strange noises from the room where I kept the doll made me uneasy. First there was a soft whispering sound, then a strange creaking sound, as if someone was moving. I got out of bed, walked into the dark room, and turned on the light. The doll was still there, motionless. But something was different. The expression on its face seemed to have changed. It was no longer as serious as before, but rather something like a smile. I told myself that I was just imagining things and went back to bed. But sleep did not come. In the silence, I heard a voice in my mind, soft but clear, calling my name. A feeling of dread washed over me as I realized that it wasn't my thoughts. The voice introduced itself as Matilda. The doll was talking to me. Not through sound, but somehow it was transmitting thoughts directly into my mind. I didn't know what to do, so I just lay there, motionless in the darkness. In the days that followed, things got even stranger. Matilda kept whispering in my mind, asking questions and talking as if we were old friends. She said she just wanted to help me, that she had the ability to see the truth in people's hearts. She proved this by revealing little things I would never have guessed, like how my coworkers were constantly stealing documents, or that the delivery guy had recently broken a package before delivering it. Curiosity overcame my initial fear. I began to trust Matilda, allowing her to intervene in my life. But everything changed when she offered to help me deal with Glenn, my neighbor who was throwing loud parties. I reluctantly agreed, thinking she would just shut him up. Hours later, I heard screaming from the apartment next door. Matilda had exposed Glenn's secret affair to his girlfriend, throwing everything into chaos. Glenn was left alone, and the peace I had longed for finally returned. But that peace was accompanied by growing anxiety. Matilda had not only seen the truth, she had manipulated it in her own way. Over the next few days, Matilda began to reveal more about herself. She said she was once part of a pair of dolls, but her sister was destroyed long ago. She didn't remember how she came to be, but she knew she had special abilities. She could see everything, even what people thought they were hiding. When I asked her what her motive was, she simply replied that she wanted to help me. But her actions became more and more frightening. She didn't stop at revealing the truth. She began to change it. Glenn, the neighbor, began to act strangely, as if he was haunted by dark thoughts. I began to feel like I was losing control of my life. One night, I woke up and found Matilda gone from my desk. I found her sitting on the sofa, her head tilted as if watching me. Her glass eyes glinted in the darkness, and I felt an indescribable presence. This was not just a doll. This was something else, powerful and dangerous. I didn't know what to do. Matilda had become a part of my life, but her presence was becoming more and more overwhelming. She told me that I needed her, that she was the only friend I could trust. But I knew the truth was far from what she said. She was more than a friend. She was a controller, a dangerous enemy hiding behind innocent eyes. I started searching for information about her, but found nothing. There was no record of a doll named Matilda, no history of her origins. She was a mystery, a living curse in the form of a toy. Every day that passes, I feel like I'm losing a part of myself. Matilda doesn't just control the people around me, she controls me. And I don't know if there's any way to escape her, or if I'm stuck in her game forever. I loved my job at Blackmere Library. It was a quiet, isolated place where I could immerse myself in ancient texts, documents that contained centuries of knowledge. But I had no idea that one night working there would change my life forever, in a way I could never get back. It all started one evening, when I was working the night shift. A group of workers were doing repairs to one of the old walls of the library when they discovered a sealed room. I was there when they opened it, and it felt wrong from the start. The air in the room smelled of mold and decay, but there was something else, a sense that it didn't belong in this world. The room was filled with old bookshelves, many of them so dusty they looked like they had been there for centuries. The covers had strange textures, some made of a material that looked like human skin. But what really caught my attention was a single sheet of paper lying on the floor. It looked like it was waiting to be picked up. As I bent down to pick up the paper, my fingers immediately noticed something was wrong. It wasn't cold, as I expected, but instead warm, almost pulsing. The words on the paper were written in a language I didn't recognize, and as I stared at them, they seemed to move, shifting back and forth before my eyes. I took the paper back to my desk, telling myself I would study it more closely under good lighting. But even as I tried to concentrate on my work, the feeling that I was not alone haunted me. The shadows between the bookshelves seemed to be moving, even though no one was there. When I put the paper down and turned on the work light, the characters on it seemed to glow faintly. I couldn't stop myself from staring at them. Every time I focused on a line, it would change, as if the words were trying to escape my gaze. Then I heard a whisper. At first I thought it was the wind, but no, this sound was different. It was more human, small words, but I couldn't make out the language. The whispers came from all directions, bouncing off the walls and echoing in my head. I stood up, trying to find the source of the sound, but the library was empty. The paper on the table made a gentle rustling sound, as if moving on its own. I tried to convince myself that this was just a figment of my imagination, but when I returned to my desk, something undeniable happened. The words on the paper had now rearranged into a single, clear line in English. "Read us." I couldn't stand it anymore. I folded the paper and stuffed it into my coat pocket, determined to leave the library as soon as my shift was over. But even as I walked away from my desk, the feeling of being watched did not leave me. The shadows along the shelves now seemed to become thicker, darker, as if they had substance. The fluorescent lights on the ceiling began to flicker, creating sudden, intermittent darkness. During one of the flickers, I saw a tall, thin figure standing at the end of the hallway. He didn't move, didn't stir, just stood there, silent, looking at me. I froze, trying to convince myself it was just an illusion. When the lights came back on, the figure was gone. But the air around me was thicker now, as if I were breathing underwater. I left the library in a panic, and when I got home, all I wanted to do was sleep. But that night, I had a dream that I knew for certain was not my mind. In my dream, I found myself back in the library, but it was no longer the same. The tall shelves of books, stacked on top of each other, formed a maze with no way out. I followed a vague call, and at the end of the path, I saw a large door. When I opened the door, darkness rushed out like a flood, swallowing all the light. I woke up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, and immediately realized something terrifying. The paper was on my desk, even though I was sure I had left it in my coat pocket. From that day on, my life became a series of strange events. The lights in my apartment flickered constantly, and I kept hearing footsteps echoing in the hallway, even though no one was there. One time, while brushing my teeth in the bathroom, I saw the silhouette of a person standing right behind me in the mirror. I turned around, but there was nothing but cold air. The paper seemed to have a life of its own. Every time I tried to throw it away, it reappeared, as if it refused to leave me. The writing on it continued to change, sometimes revealing passages in ancient languages I could not understand, sometimes just strange symbols. The worst night came when I decided to take the paper back to the library. I hoped that returning it to where it belonged would be the end of it. When I entered the library at midnight, I realized that everything had changed. The shelves seemed taller, the shadows between the rows so thick that I could barely see through them. As I placed the paper on the table, it suddenly glowed, a cold light spreading throughout the room. I heard heavy footsteps behind me, and when I turned around, I saw the figure I had seen before. He stood right in front of me, tall and distorted, as if he did not belong to this world. He said nothing, but a voice rang out in my head, clear and sharp. "You have been chosen. You will not escape." I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. He came closer, and darkness enveloped me. I felt cold, as if all the warmth had been sucked out of my body. In the last moment before I blacked out, I heard a whisper echoing, You belong to us." When I woke up, I was lying on the library floor, but the paper was gone. I don't know what happened, but from that day on, I never felt truly awake again. The dreams continued, and the figure was always there. I knew he was still watching me, waiting for the moment I let my guard down. This story doesn't end here. I don't know when, but I feel like the day he returns is drawing near. I just hope I can survive to tell the next part. My name is Edward Cartwright, an ordinary administrative worker who has just moved to the suburbs of Bristol. It is a quiet town with cobblestone streets and straight tree lines, but sometimes the quiet can make me feel a little lonely. After a long day at work and shopping for a new flat, all I want to do is go home, collapse on the sofa and forget about my tiredness. But that night, something strange happened, something that made me realize that reality can be scarier than any nightmare. I left the last store, a large suburban supermarket, carrying 2 heavy shopping bags. My thick coat was no match for the biting January chill, and my gloves were already soaked with melted snow. The pale yellow light from the parking lot lamps cast hazy shadows on the wet pavement. The parking lot wasn't crowded, with only a few cars scattered among the long lines, and most of the people had already gotten in and left. I walked quickly through the rows of cars, looking for my gray Renault Clio. I remembered parking near the number 7 traffic light, but when I got there was no car. At first, I thought I had made a mistake, so I turned around and tried the next row of cars. The bags in my hands seemed to be getting heavier, forcing me to stop for a moment to rest. I looked around, trying to remember where I had parked, but the parking lot seemed to have changed. The rows of cars looked the same, and nothing seemed familiar. I started moving from row to row, my confusion turning to anxiety. It felt like every time I passed a row, the space stretched a little longer, making me lose my bearings. The cars were scattered in the pale orange light, but my Renault was still nowhere to be seen. I thought, maybe I'm just tired. Don't panic. Just focus. I took out my phone to turn on the flashlight and find the car easier. But the screen showed a strange message. No signal. That didn't make sense, because I always had good cell service here. I tried calling my friend to tell him about the strange situation, but the call didn't go through. I felt a strange tension in the air, as if I was being watched. Suddenly, I heard footsteps in the distance. At first, I thought it was someone else looking for their car, but as I listened more closely, I realized that the footsteps were unusual. They were steady, strong, but not human. The sound echoed, then stopped abruptly. I turned my head to look around, but saw no one. As I was trying to find my way, I saw a light shining in the distance, near the edge of the parking lot. A pale blue light, blinking like a beacon. I hoped it was my car and walked quickly toward it. But as I got closer, I realized the light wasn't coming from a car. It was coming from the ground, right between the rows of cars. A small circle was etched into the asphalt, emitting a faint glow. I bent down to take a closer look. There were strange symbols in the circle that I couldn't make out, like some kind of ancient writing. When I touched it, a cold air rushed through me, making me shiver. Suddenly, everything around me became quiet. The whistling wind, the distant sound of engines, all disappeared. The parking lot became eerily silent. I stood up, panicked, and stepped back. But when I turned around, I realized that the space around me had changed. The lines of cars now stretched endlessly, disappearing into the darkness. The number 7 lamppost that I remembered so clearly before was no longer there. The light from the lampposts gradually dimmed, giving way to a dense darkness. My heart pounded as I saw a gray Renault Clio in the distance. That must be my car, I thought, and I sprinted towards it. But as I got closer, I realized something was wrong. There was a person sitting in the driver's seat. They sat still, their back to me, their head tilted to one side as if they were sleeping. I tapped lightly on the glass, my hand feeling cold. The person didn't move. When I leaned down to look through the glass, my whole body froze. That face was mine. A perfect replica, but with empty eyes and a crooked, unnatural smile. They turned to look at me, their empty eyes glowing strangely in the darkness. My breath caught. The person in the car slowly raised his hand and waved at me, slowly but hauntingly. I backed away, my legs shaking, but I couldn't take my eyes off my strange double. Suddenly, they turned on the engine. The roar broke the dead silence. The car slowly rolled away, and my double stared at me through the rearview mirror, the twisted smile still there. They drove away into the darkness, leaving me standing alone in the vast parking lot. I tried to run in the direction they had gone, but the parking lot seemed to go on forever. The lights faded, leaving an eerie darkness that I couldn't escape. I began to hear whispers, like voices from afar. They weren't speaking in a language I understood, but it felt like they were calling my name. In desperation, I turned back to the glowing circle, but it was gone too. The ground was cold now, and I realized my feet were standing on a thin layer of water, although there was no sign of rain. The darkness around me began to move, as if it were alive, wrapping around me bit by bit. I don't know how long I walked, only that I couldn't find my way out. Time became hazy, and space seemed to bend and curve in unnatural ways. I realized that I was no longer in the parking lot, but somewhere else, a distorted reality where everything was disorienting. As I looked back, the distorted silhouette of my doppelganger loomed in the darkness, getting closer with every step. I had nowhere to hide. The last time I saw my doppelganger, it was grinning and saying something I couldn't make out. And then, the darkness swallowed everything. Darkness enveloped the Transylvanian village, swallowing the wooden houses and cobblestone streets strewn with snow. Johan Kostek, a young boy of 16, lay on a single wooden bed in his small room, drifting between chaotic thoughts and fitful sleep. The faint light of the moon filtered through the coarsely woven curtains, casting a cold silver hue over the room. On the windowsills, crudely carved wooden statues of Saint Nicholas and Jesus stood silently watching, as if holding the soul of the room in the silence of the night. Beside the bed was a pair of old boots, the tips caked with dried mud from a previous trip to the woods. A long priest's robe, more carefully preserved than anything else in the house, hung silently on a lone hook. Though it was Johan's property, he had never truly felt worthy of wearing it. As the son of a devout family, he had been forced into the priesthood, a path he had never truly believed in. Yet he had continued, not out of conviction, but because he had no other choice. The room was filled with a heavy silence. But suddenly, a sharp scream tore through the night, followed by the sound of galloping horses from the village. Johan jumped up, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked around the dark room, his breath coming out in thin puffs. The strange noise seemed to awaken the entire village. Wooden doors opened, and flickering lanterns began to appear on the main street, stretching like a river of fire in the darkness. Johan hurriedly put on his thick coat, wrapped a woolen scarf around his neck, and picked up his oil lantern. He left the small room and stepped out into the cold air. The village street was now crowded with people, gathered around the point where the screams had come from. As Johan pushed through the crowd, his heart clenched at the sight before him. In the middle of the snowy road lay a corpse. It was a young girl, her red hair tangled and falling to the ground. Her face was horribly disfigured, as if someone had clawed at it. Black streaks of blood coagulated, contrasting with the pure white snow below. Her body lay motionless, bent at unnatural angles. The sight made Johan turn away, trying to swallow the nausea that was rising in his chest. A mounted policeman, Officer Radu, stood near the body. His eyes were tense, and his voice was firm. "Get away. Everyone stay back." But the crowd only took a few steps back, still staring at the body as if hypnotized. A young woman, who had found the body first, was kneeling nearby. She was shaking, her eyes wide with horror, and tears were streaming down her cheeks. Yoan stepped forward to support her, but her shaking was so strong that he almost lost his balance. Radu turned to her and asked, "What did you see? Was there anyone? Tell me." But the woman was speechless, just shaking her head and sobbing uncontrollably. The policeman realized that he would not get an answer, so he turned to a man in the crowd and shouted, "Run to the police station. Call the authorities and bring someone here immediately." As the man ran, the crowd fell into a heavy silence. The lights of their lanterns danced across the snow, but no one dared to speak. Yoan bent down, his gaze accidentally meeting the corpse's wide, lifeless eyes. A cold sensation spread from his spine to the top of his head. This was no ordinary murder. There was something beyond his understanding. He looked around, his eyes passing over the dark houses, the bare trees, the thick darkness. It seemed like something was lurking, watching, waiting. A feeling of unease crept into his heart. Suddenly, a strong wind blew, carrying with it a strange whisper. Yoan turned his head, but saw nothing. The lantern in his hand flickered, as if about to go out. Officer Radu ordered everyone to return to their homes and not come out until the authorities arrived. But as the crowd began to disperse, some whispered old stories, tales of demons, vampires, and vengeful spirits. Yoan did not believe in such superstitions, but tonight, anything seemed possible. Yoan led the woman home, but as soon as he stepped through the doorway, he felt as if someone was watching him. When he turned around, he saw that the darkness was thicker than ever, as if it had a shape and a will of its own. The lanterns in the village seemed to dim, and footsteps echoed on the snow-covered streets, but no one but Yoan could hear them. When he returned to his cottage, Yoan closed the door and bolted it. He knelt before the statue of Saint Nicholas, but for the first time in his life, he felt his prayers fall on deaf ears. He looked out the window, the moon lit up the night sky, but the darkness outside seemed stronger than the moon's light. He lay down on the bed, trying to calm down, but every time he closed his eyes, the image of the lifeless eyes of the corpse appeared in his mind. The strange whispering sounded again, this time clearer. It was not just the wind, but like voices, invitations from somewhere far away and cold. Yoan stayed awake all night. As the first light of dawn filtered through the curtains, he decided to leave the village. He didn't know what had happened that night, but he was certain of one thing. It was not the work of man. And if he stayed, he had a feeling that he would be the next victim of the darkness that enveloped this place. I never thought that Memories of Ali would become an indelible part of a story that I didn't want to believe. The days before he disappeared, everything was peaceful. It was a mild summer, and we had decided to spend a few days together on a secluded beach, where the gentle waves and clear blue skies were the perfect backdrop for relaxing moments. Ali always carried himself with a calmness, as if nothing in the world could shake him. It was that calmness that had attracted me from the first time I met him, and it was also the reason I believed in the longevity of our relationship. We spent our weekends walking along the beach, collecting pieces of sea glass that the waves washed up on the shore. It was a small hobby for both of us, a simple but meaningful act. The pieces of glass, with their strange colors and shapes, always seemed to carry a story from the deep ocean. During those gatherings, Ali often kept the pieces with the most unique colors. I often teased him that he was too picky, but that was how he cherished every little moment in life. That afternoon, he found a different piece of glass. It was small, but its deep red color caught my eye. It seemed to glow faintly, even as the sun faded from the sky. He held the piece in his hand, examining it from every angle, as if fascinated by some strange attraction. I didn't think much of it at the time, just that it was a rare moment of his curiosity showing. But now, looking back, I realized that everything changed from that moment on. That evening, the sea seemed quieter than usual. The sky was full of stars, and the moonlight illuminated the water, creating a peaceful scene. We walked along the long sandy beach, our feet sinking into the cool, moist sand. I remember the atmosphere clearly, the feeling of the gentle sea breeze, and the sound of the gentle waves. But what I cannot forget is the silence. Not a comfortable silence, but an unusual, heavy silence, as if the sea were holding its breath. Ollie hadn't said much since he'd picked up the red glass. He walked slowly, his gaze absently fixed on the ocean. The moonlight reflected off the water, creating shimmering bands of light, and sometimes I'd see him lift the piece of glass, studying it as if searching for something. When I turned to look, he'd walked farther away, his feet sinking into the water. I'd stop, standing on the shore, watching his back. The moonlight reflected off the water, the red light from the piece of glass in his hand glowing even more intensely. Before I could do anything, his silhouette disappeared under the cold black water. No sound, no sign. He just disappeared, as if the ocean had swallowed him in a single moment. The first few days were a constant panic. I called the police, but to no avail. They found no sign of Ollie, no footprints, no debris, nothing. The investigators concluded that he had drowned or left on his own. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Ollie wasn't the type to leave without a word. And the last image of him still haunts me. His glowing red eyes, the way he disappeared into the perfect silence of the sea. The following nights, I began to have strange dreams. I found myself standing on the beach, the cold sea lapping at my feet. In the distance, in the pale moonlight, stood the silhouette of Ollie, motionless on the sand. But around him, huge red towers rose, emitting an eerie glow. They were oddly shaped, their angles defying any geometrical rules I had ever known. I tried to get closer, but each step seemed heavier, the air around me seemed to thicken. In my dreams, I heard faint whispers, sounds indistinct but menacing. Every morning I woke up feeling like I had experienced something untouchable, another world that reason could not explain. The dreams lasted for a week, until I could not stand it anymore. I decided to go back to the beach. I arrived at the beach at dusk, when the last light was just a faint streak of color in the sky. The wind was blowing harder, carrying a metallic scent I had never smelled before. The sea was still, but there was an invisible tension in the air, as if something was waiting. As I got closer to where Ollie had disappeared, I saw it. A faint red light, shimmering beneath the water. It was not fixed, but moving as if inviting. I stepped closer, my legs trembling with fear, but unable to resist its strange attraction. I took off my shoes, stepped into the cold water, and bent down to lift the piece of red glass from the water. As the glass touched my palm, I felt a warmth spread, as if it were seeping into my body. The light within the glass grew stronger, flickering like a beating heart. I stood there motionless, as vague voices began to echo in my head. The voices made no sense, but they carried a strange power, telling of a city under the ocean, where red towers rose from the depths of darkness. I looked up, and for the first time, I saw other red lights glimmering in the distance beneath the water. They formed a path, leading deeper into the darkness of the ocean. I knew I shouldn't follow them, but deep down, I also knew I couldn't turn back. I couldn't leave Ollie behind. I began to follow the red lights, the cold sea water rising to my knees, then my waist, and finally, I had to swim. Each light I touched disappeared, but always led me to another light, deeper, farther. The air gradually became thick, and I felt like I was swimming through another world. As I neared exhaustion, I saw it. The red city emerged from the darkness, its huge towers rising, glowing surreally. Shapes danced on the walls, forming strange symbols in an ancient language. In the center of the city, I saw Ollie. He stood there, hunched over a tower, his eyes redder than ever. He was no longer himself. I stepped forward, and the red light enveloped me, pulling me into the darkness of the towers. I knew I found him, but I also knew I would never return. My life had been a series of failures interspersed with fragile moments of hope. I lost my job, my home, the people I once called friends. It all happened so fast, and in just a few months, I went from being a stable person to a homeless person in the city I once called home. With nights spent in my old car, my body aching and my mind suffocating with chaotic thoughts, I realized that I didn't have much time left to hold on. My savings were depleted, and I was close to accepting my fate. That's when I saw the ad. Room for rent. $400 per month, utilities included. The words on the phone screen were a ray of light in the dense darkness that was enveloping me. In this city, with sky-high rents, it was an unbelievable thing. Without thinking much, I called the number in the ad, my heart pounding as I clung to my last chance of survival. Harlan, the homeowner, answered the phone in a hoarse but steady voice. The conversation was brief and curt, but he agreed to meet me the next afternoon to see the house. I didn't know what to expect, but in my situation, I had no right to refuse. Whether it was a shabby room or even a basement, if it was a place to lie down and get away from the cold of the old car, I was willing. The house is located in a quiet neighborhood, surrounded by old trees, their roots digging into the ground as if they had witnessed centuries of change. The house is not large, but surprisingly neat and clean. The small windows are covered with white curtains, the weak sunlight filtering through, creating a cozy and melancholy atmosphere. Harlan, a gaunt old man with thinning gray hair and deep-set eyes, greeted me with a faint smile. He led me through the house, walking slowly, his voice soft but authoritative. He showed me the small kitchen, the neat living room, and the room I would be renting. Everything was normal, even more comfortable than I expected. Still, I couldn't help but notice one unusual detail: the door at the end of the hallway. The door was unlike any other in the house. It was thicker, strangely smooth, the color of burnt wood. There was no handle, no visible hinges. It stood there like a stranger in a friendly house, invading its own space. When my gaze lingered on it too long, Harlan glanced at me, a warning flickering in his eyes. He didn't say anything about the door, and I didn't ask. But even then, I knew the door wouldn't leave me alone. The first few days in the house were peaceful, but the peace made me feel uneasy. The house was so quiet, as if all sound had been sucked out of the four walls. During the day, I spent my time looking for a job and trying to get my life back together. At night, I lay on my old single bed, listening to the absolute silence, occasionally interrupted by the wind blowing through the cracks in the window. However, the silence did not last long. On the fourth night, I heard it for the first time. A soft whisper, as fleeting as the wind, but with rhythm and emphasis. At first, I thought it was just the wind whistling through the cracks in the walls. But as I listened harder, the sound became clearer. It wasn't the wind. It was voices blending together, murmuring from behind the door at the end of the hallway. I stepped out of the room, my legs heavy with an invisible fear. The dim light from the hallway barely illuminated the silhouette of the door. The whispering continued, as if it knew I was approaching. I stood in front of the door, listening, and felt a chill run through me. Even though I couldn't see anything, I knew that there was more than just empty space behind the door. Over the next few nights, the sounds grew stronger. Among the murmurs, there were high-pitched tones, like calls from far away. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt the presence of something, an invisible but distinct entity watching me from behind the door. On Saturday night, I heard a knock. At first, it was soft, steady, as if someone were tapping on the door from the other side. But gradually the sound became more intense, as if something was trying to get out. My name was whispered, this time clear and distinct, a direct invitation to my ear. The fear turned into an obsession. My dreams were filled with images of other doors, leading to the same place, a vast space, filled with darkness and glowing red eyes watching me. I couldn't tell what was real and what was an illusion. But one thing I knew for sure. The door was not just an inanimate object. Harlan left the house late one afternoon, leaving me alone with the eerie silence. I sat in my room, staring at the wall, trying to block out the thought of the door. But the whispers didn't stop. They became more insistent, as if they knew this was their only chance to engage me. Finally, I couldn't stand it anymore. I stood up and walked out into the hallway. The door stood there, like a sentinel waiting. I reached out and touched its surface, feeling a cold current rush across my skin. Without thinking, I pushed with all my might. The door opened, and darkness poured out like a living wave. It was not ordinary darkness, but a deep darkness with a will of its own. The space inside was like an endless abyss, where light could not exist. I saw glowing red eyes appear in the darkness, one pair at a time, staring straight at me. Hundreds, thousands of voices rang out, blending into an unbearable sound. The darkness clung to me, pulling me closer. I tried to pull away, but a thin, cold hand reached out from the darkness, holding me tight. With a strength I didn't know where it came from, I pushed the door shut. When Harlan returned, he said nothing. He just looked at me with a sad, resigned look, as if this were not the first time this had happened. I left the house that night, leaving all my belongings behind. But I could not escape the door. The whispers followed me home, echoing in my dreams, creeping into every dark corner of my life. Sometimes, I feel the red eyes in the dark, watching me, waiting. I know that once you hear the door, you will never escape it. My family lives in a small house in the suburbs, away from the hustle and bustle of the city, where the air is fresh and quiet. The house is built in a classic style, with beige walls and a small, pretty garden in front, where my daughter, Sophie, and I often spend time every weekend planting trees and playing. The family has lived here for more than 7 years, and although there is sometimes noise from the surrounding neighborhood, we have always felt that this is a peaceful, safe place. My parents, both working professionals, taught me to value family and the joy of simple things. My wife, Annabelle, and I both worked in different companies in the city, but we always tried to spend time together in the evenings and on weekends. Our daughter, Sophie, was a gentle, happy child who rarely caused us any trouble. Our life seemed stable and complete, but it all changed late one night, when the peace suddenly turned into an inexplicable obsession. It was a night unlike any other. Last night, my daughter returned home from a classmate's birthday party. The party ended quite late, around midnight. When I picked her up, most of the lights in the house where the party was held were off, save for a few flickering lights from the porch. Sophie looked tired, but nothing out of the ordinary. I drove her home in silence, thinking we both needed a good night's sleep to start the week. When she got home, Sophie went straight to her room after changing into her pajamas. My wife was also tired and retreated to her room. I stayed in the living room to watch the rest of the football match. The exhaustion from a long day at work washed over me, and I fell asleep on the sofa. The house was filled with its usual silence, broken only by the whispering of the commentator on the TV. In the middle of the night, I felt a slight movement on my hand. The touch startled me awake. When I opened my eyes, I saw Sophie standing before me, her hair disheveled, her eyes unfamiliar, her expression unreadable. In the dim light of the TV, I tried to focus my vision. Her small hand held something, and only when Sophie lifted it to my face did I realize what it was. For human fingers severed. The fingers looked like they belonged to a small hand, but there was no sign of life. The skin was pale, with dark streaks of dried blood around the base of the fingers. The faint stench from the cut filled my nostrils, making my stomach churn. I looked at Sophie, not knowing what to do. She just stood there, not saying a word, her eyes seeming to pierce through me. Then she turned and walked up the stairs, leaving me alone with my chaotic thoughts and unspeakable horror. The next morning, my wife and I tried to ask Sophie what had happened. She didn't answer, just stared out the window, her eyes absent but strangely distant, as if she was keeping a secret that she didn't want anyone to know. Breakfast passed in a heavy atmosphere, and I decided to find out everything. I called the family who had hosted the party, trying to keep my voice calm as I asked them what had happened. They said everything was completely normal, the party had been fun, and Sophie had shown no signs of anything unusual. I also checked the house for any sign of the Four Fingers' origin, but there was nothing. No blood, no clues, nothing but an eerie silence from Sophie. That night, I decided to stay in the living room to watch for anything unusual. Sophie went to bed early, without any signs of rebellion or stubbornness. But as the house darkened, I began to hear strange sounds. A soft laugh drifted down the hallway to Sophie's room, a faint sound that made my skin crawl. I stood up, tiptoed down the hallway, and as I neared her door, the sound stopped. Sophie's door was ajar, the light from the nightlight peeking through the crack. I looked inside and saw her sitting in the middle of the room, surrounded by scribbles on paper. The drawings were unlike anything I'd ever seen. They were strange symbols, like ancient symbols, written in a dark red ink. Sophie was whispering, a deep voice unlike any I'd ever heard. I stepped back, afraid that if I continued to watch, I would see something I could not bear. But at that moment, Sophie raised her head. Her eyes were no longer human eyes, but two dark pits, reflecting no light. She looked at me, not moving, not expressing, but her gaze was so threatening that I felt I should not stay there another second. I went back to the living room, closed the door, and sat on the couch, trying to calm myself. But strange sounds continued to come from Sophie's room, knocking, scratching on the wall, and whispering that I couldn't understand. I didn't sleep that night, just sat there, waiting for morning to come as a salvation. As dawn broke, I decided to act. I couldn't let this go on. But as I climbed the stairs to check on Sophie, I found her door wide open. Inside, the room was empty, with no sign of Sophie or any of her belongings. There were only drawings on paper, spread across the floor, each with a finger drawn in strange red ink. A cold feeling enveloped me, and I understood that Sophie was gone. And what I was seeing was not just the result of a strange night, but the beginning of something much more terrible. My life was as calm and boring as any other high school student. But everything changed one autumn morning, when my mind was haunted by a house across the street, the house of Tommy, a classmate who had disappeared with his family a few years ago. It was a shocking event for the whole neighborhood, but over time, people gradually forgot about it, and the house became a deserted, forgotten place. However, I could not have imagined that this very house would drag me into a nightmare that I could never imagine. I remember very clearly that morning, when the school bus slowly rolled through the familiar neighborhood. Sitting in the back row, I unconsciously looked out the window, and my eyes stopped at Tommy's house. There was something there that I could not take my eyes off. In the second-floor window, I saw a pale hand waving. A slow, languid wave, but enough to make me feel creepy. I couldn't understand it. The house had been empty for a long time, and no one lived there anymore. The feeling of being watched haunted me all day. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just my imagination, but the image of the hand kept swirling in my mind, like a warning. In the days that followed, I couldn't help but look towards the house every time the bus passed by. But the house was always dark. The second-floor windows were still as silent as before. I wondered if I was imagining things, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. I started looking into Tommy and his family, but the information was vague. The police could not explain why the family disappeared. Some people in the neighborhood said they left without a trace, while others whispered about strange things happening around the house. Curiosity grew. I felt myself being pulled toward the house, urged by an invisible force I could not resist. After the first time I saw the waving hand, my nights became unusual. I started having strange dreams. In them, I was standing in front of Tommy's house, staring out the second-story window. But this time, it wasn't just a hand. I saw a shadowy figure, standing silently in the darkness. They didn't move, but their eyes seemed to pierce right through me, cold and empty. Every time I woke up, my body felt drenched in sweat, but my mind felt foggy. I felt restless and anxious all day. I dared not tell anyone about what I saw, because I did not know if I was losing my mind or not. One Saturday afternoon, I couldn't resist any longer. I decided to go back to the neighborhood where Tommy used to live alone. I walked down the deserted street, the air so heavy that I felt like every sound was muffled. When Tommy's house came into view, my heart clenched. The house still stood there, silent in the dark, but this time, it seemed to radiate a strange attraction. I stood across the street, staring out the second-story window. Nothing happened, but the feeling of being watched became more intense than ever. I felt like there was a gaze watching me from inside the house, but every time I tried to look, all I got was eerie silence. Suddenly, a cold wind blew by, carrying with it a stench of rotting flesh. I shivered and turned to leave, but a shadow flashed in the corner of my eye, causing me to stop. When I turned back, I saw that the second-floor window was open. I couldn't remember when it had opened, but it was clearly open. After that fateful trip, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had taken something from Tommy's house with me. I began to hear strange noises in my house, soft footsteps on the floor, distant whispers from hidden corners. Sometimes I felt like something was standing right behind me, but every time I turned around, all I could see was darkness. One night, as I lay in bed, the light from my bedside lamp flickered on and off. In the silence, I heard a whisper, clear and distinct, calling my name. I don't remember how I woke up, but I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Days later, I received a text message from an old friend. The message was simple but haunting. Remember Tommy? His house, something's wrong. I didn't reply, but it left me feeling suffocated. The feeling of being watched, the sense of an invisible presence in Tommy's house, all of it compounded into an obsession that couldn't be dispelled. As each day passed, I realized more and more that the house was more than just an abandoned place. It was like a portal connecting our world to another reality, where darkness and unknown entities awaited. I don't know what happened to Tommy and his family, but I know for sure that they never left. They were still there, along with something, or part of it. I don't know if I have the courage to go back to that house. But I know that one day, I will have to face it. The house will not leave me alone, and something in the dark is waiting for me. The story begins on a dark night, when I sat in front of my computer screen, trying to find some entertainment to relax after a long day of stressful work. My job is not too exciting, just a normal office job, giving me nothing but evenings sitting in front of the screen, trying to forget the boredom of life. At that moment, I decided to try out a strange website that I stumbled upon in a forum post. The claims about it were vague, but I was intrigued. The site seemed quite strange, with an old-fashioned interface that looked like it had been around since the 90s, but was filled with spooky images and an enticing invitation to discover the unseen. I didn't think much of it and quickly logged in. As soon as I did, a pop-up window opened with a single question. "Are you ready?" I hesitated, but then decided to click agree without thinking much. And so the story begins. At first, everything seemed normal. I was just seeing odd images, pictures of unknown origin, but something kept me scrolling. The pictures appeared randomly, seemingly taken randomly in empty rooms with dim light shining through dirty windows, or shadows lurking in an abandoned house. Some of the images overlapped, nothing stood out. But after a while, I started to see them change. The pictures became sharper, more detailed. Faces slowly appeared in the frames, eyes staring at me, out of the darkness. I tried to ignore it, but it wouldn't stop. And then my computer screen suddenly lit up. A line of text appeared. "Thank you for participating." My heart pounded, I felt nervous. A strange feeling filled my body. At the same time, a soft sound came from the computer speakers, like a whisper. I jerked back and looked around the room, but nothing was different. I couldn't tear myself away from the screen now. I didn't know why, but something inside me wanted to continue. The whispering grew clearer, and then something strange began to appear on the screen. An old photograph, blurry and haunting. It was an empty room with a swivel chair in the middle of it. I looked closer and realized that in the chair, a person was sitting, not moving. I couldn't take my eyes off the picture, but in my head, a voice rang out, making me shiver. "Don't look at it. Don't do it." A feeling of dread rose, but I couldn't turn it off. Suddenly, the chair in the photo turned, and I saw a face appear from the darkness. A twisted, unfathomable smile, a smile that was not human. My computer suddenly made a soft ping sound, as if there was a new message. My eyes couldn't take their eyes off the screen. I opened the message and read, "You are part of us now. We will not let you go." I stood up in shock and hurried out of the room, but my hand was still glued to the screen. I don't know why, but I couldn't leave it. I turned back and looked at the computer, again seeing the changing images, and in the dim light of the screen, I realized that I was being watched. Eyes, shadows, and incomprehensible laughter echoed in my head, becoming clearer and clearer. I sat down in front of my computer screen, trying to focus on my work. But after a long, stressful day at work, my mind couldn't focus on anything other than fatigue. A thought flashed through my mind about the strange website I had explored the night before, and I decided to try it again. The website was still there, waiting silently. This time, I felt no doubt, only an uncontrollable curiosity. I quickly clicked on the link, and then a pop-up window appeared, just like before. But this time there was something different. A big red line appeared. "Are you ready to go further?" I didn't think much of it, just clicked the accept button, and the computer screen immediately flashed. The pictures started to appear faster and clearer. At first they were blurry and unclear, but now everything became clear. The pictures were so detailed that I could see every cloud in the sky, every crack in the wall. Then, the last picture made me shiver. It was a picture of the room I was sitting in, but strangely, there was a figure standing right behind me. I looked around, there was no one but me, but clearly the figure was standing right behind me, on the computer screen. I quickly turned around, but saw nothing. A feeling of fear and unease rose inside me. Somehow, I was drawn back into that curiosity. I turned back to the screen. The picture began to change strangely, as if an invisible hand was drawing on it. The colors on the screen changed, and a stranger's face appeared. At first it was a blurry face, but gradually it became clearer, with dark eyes and a twisted, inexplicable smile. I felt like the face was looking straight at me, through the screen, through space. I stood up in a panic, wanting to escape this strange feeling, but my hands were still glued to the chair. My eyes couldn't leave the screen. The images on it began to change rapidly, no longer seeming like photographs, but rather short, blurry, haunting clips. I couldn't understand what was happening. Then, a strange sound came from the computer speakers, like a sigh. Immediately, I noticed a line of text appear on the screen. "We have been following you." The feeling I had was one of pure panic. I couldn't tear myself away from the screen, couldn't do anything but stare at it, even though I knew I should turn off the computer and leave. Whispers and giggles started to ring out around me, as if thousands of people were standing in the room, watching me. But when I turned around, there was no one but me. I couldn't move from my chair. My eyes were still glued to the screen. And then the picture changed again. This time, I didn't see a face, but a blurry figure, standing right next to me. It didn't move, just stood there, silent. I couldn't move, couldn't say a word. A cold feeling enveloped me, as if a cold wave had passed through my body. I felt icy fingers touching my hand, an invisible but powerful force pulling me closer to the screen. My eyes couldn't tear away, and before my eyes, that face had a creepy smile again. Then once again the text appeared. "You are a part of us. You can't leave." Suddenly, the screen lit up so bright it blinded me. All I could hear was my breathing, heavy and rapid. I couldn't stop, couldn't move away. It felt like an invisible force was taking over me, pulling me into another space from which I couldn't escape. And then, the screen went black. For a second, everything went black. But then, a line of text appeared, larger, clearer than ever. "We will meet again." My eyes widened. My heart was beating so fast I thought I would faint. I couldn't understand what was happening. I didn't know if I was awake or dreaming. But one thing was certain. I couldn't escape that strange world. Alara and I had been in this house for a few months, and life seemed to be starting to fall into place. The relief and freedom of being free from the control of our parents, who had always imposed so much on our lives, had finally arrived. We loved the quiet atmosphere of this small town, where everything was new and hopeful. But in that peaceful atmosphere, we began to notice strange things. The first day we moved in, everything seemed normal. But it wasn't long before things started to get weird. The bedroom door, which we had always used to protect our privacy, wasn't always as tight as we remembered. One morning, I woke up to find the door ajar, even though neither of us had touched it. Over the next few days, I found strange marks in the house, small pieces of debris that I couldn't explain. I thought I was just stressed and anxious about the move, but things just got more and more confusing. One evening, as Alara and I sat on the sofa in the living room, I heard a soft sound coming from the hallway. It was as if someone was walking, softly but firmly. Alara heard it too, but said nothing. At the time, we thought it was just a strange sound coming from outside, but an inexplicable feeling rose up inside me. I got up and went out into the hallway, but there was only silence. No one was there. Then another evening, while we were getting ready for dinner, I suddenly noticed a pale blue door behind the coats in the closet. I had never noticed it before. It was a small door, with the paint worn away by time, but there was something strange about its appearance. Its presence made me feel confused, as if it had always been there, and we had never noticed it. Alara was also surprised to see it. "Are you sure this isn't the first time we've seen this door?" she asked, her eyes fixed on the door. She was clearly uneasy, and I couldn't explain it. I tried the door, but it wasn't locked, just a regular door leading to a small, dark room. There was nothing in the room but an old table, some scattered old books, and a single candle burning. The light was weak, but enough to create an eerie atmosphere. But the strangest thing was the old telescope placed in the middle of the room. It was beautifully crafted, although old, but it seemed to have a strange function. I couldn't resist my curiosity. I went closer, and looked into the lens. When I saw the sky, I immediately realized that it was not our sky. The sight through the telescope sent a chill down my spine. A black star that didn't shine, a shattered planet, and a strange sky unlike anything we knew. The space around me felt warped, as if I was looking at a universe that should never have existed. Elara stood behind me, looking into the telescope with a look of horror on her face. "This isn't our sky," she whispered. "Finn, what is this?" We couldn't explain it, but every day we returned to that room. The old books, though familiar, turned into nightmares when we opened them. Books we thought we knew by heart ended differently, dark and terrifying. A week later, we decided to tell the Whitakers what had happened. We invited them into our home, trying to calm them down and hoping they would help explain the strange events. But when we led them into the bedroom and approached where the pale blue door usually appeared, they saw nothing. The door was gone. This made Elara and I even more confused. But not long after, the door appeared again, and this time it led to a new room, an old schoolroom, with a wooden desk, candles, and strange books. This room was similar to the previous one, but it was larger, darker, and had an eerie feeling, as if something was watching us. We couldn't stop searching. But the more we explored, the more we felt trapped in a trap we couldn't escape. The pale blue door wasn't just a door. It was the entrance to another world, a dark universe that didn't belong to us. And then one night, when we decided to go deeper into the strange room again, a strange noise was heard. Something had changed. Footsteps echoed in the darkness, and the room began to change. We ran, but everything seemed to close in. Darkness fell. The door was gone, but the feeling that it was still there somewhere in the house haunted us. We no longer wanted to search for answers. The house had changed us, made us people who could not return. Then we decided to leave, without saying goodbye, without explaining. We sold the house. But when it was put up for sale, the feeling that we had left a part of ourselves behind was indelible. We never returned, but that house, with its strange doors and unexplained mysteries, still haunts us. And I never forget.